What's up everyone, how are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Naruto story. What if Naruto is Meliodas' brother? If you enjoy then please like, share and do comments. Okay, it's just my brothers and a girl who was blessed with our father's magic that none of us knew existed, living in the same space as the 7 deadly sins, and everyone is leaving me on my own with those 3. It's fine, we're fine, it's all good. It absolutely was not all good. But Meliodas was the last person who would ever admit that under any circumstances. The first issue with this was that his younger brothers, who had fought against them since the First Holy War, were now living in the recently remodeled Boar Hat with their not so long ago mortal enemies, who still did not completely trust them. The second issue was that Merlin, ever since being revealed as his sort of adopted power-wise at least sister, had been acting less like the calculating, charismatic Merlin he'd known for forever and more like the mischievous, if still brilliant and terrifying, child from 3,000 years ago, even staying in her childlike form for most of the time that he saw her. The third was that Estarossa had returned to the smaller form that mirrored his, and that literally no one was comfortable watching a smaller version of himself with silvery hair trotting around. And the fourth was that the others expected him to, well, the most accurate word would be babysit those 2 plus Zeldris while Elizabeth was negotiating treaties with the giants, escorted by Diane and King, who had officially been crowned the Giant Queen and Fairy King respectively. Ban and Elaine were off enjoying a festival, and they deserved to, after everything they'd been through. He was incredibly happy for them, and Escanor was busy closing down his bar so he could work at the Boar Hat full-time. Gowther was doing, he honestly had no idea and he wasn't sure he wanted to know. And Hawk was on vacation, having spied a sow of questionable origin and gained permission from Hawk Mama to go court her, and Meliodas definitely didn't want to know about that. Which left him, and a bar, and 2 millennia-old demons that acted like children, led by a warlock who was too clever for his sanity to remain intact. "Meliodas, you're extremely pale," Elizabeth remarked. He jerked his head up, meeting her eyes with a sheepish grin. She looked beautiful, as always, with her hair pulled back and a small diadem settled on her head. But it wasn't about how she looked both perfectly competent and exquisite, or the fact that her hair was a shimmering waterfall of pure moonlight in the glow of the Boar Hat's lanterns. She looked happy, as if she was in her element, born to complete the mission ahead of her. She was complete. All she ever wanted was to bring peace, and now she actually gets to negotiate with the 5 clans. A small smile tugged at his mouth and he stood on his toes, kissing Elizabeth on the cheek. Ban and Elaine were already gone, Diane and King waiting for her just outside. "Don't come back until you have the first inter-clan peace treaty, okay?" Elizabeth laughed, the sound shining in the air like the peal of a bell. "What if I have to? Then we're throwing a party and drinking until we all die of alcohol poisoning." Her eyes twinkled. "A fitting way to die for us heroes, I suppose." "Obviously." He crossed his arms and gave her a trademark grin, and bright and full of a confidence that he wasn't sure he actually felt. He could feel 3 pairs of eyes, 2 black and 1 gold, boring into his back with barely hidden malice. "Go on, you'll be late at this rate. I'll be back by tomorrow night at the latest." She winked, turning to stalk out the door. "Thought it'll be sooner. I suspect they've never met a diplomat who's run a restaurant during a war." Meliodas blinked at her and wondered how the hell, after everything they went through, he was still lucky enough that this woman loved him. "No, they certainly haven't," he agreed, walking around and kissing her again. "Don't worry, everything will be fine. I trust you," she murmured, touching her forehead to his. He heard Estarossa retching behind his back and rolled his eyes, leaning into the touch before stepping back and watching her go. "She's off to change the world and I am, beyond lucky." The door closed, and he was alone with the 3 children who were not actually children. With a sigh, he was going to die tonight, honestly, who were perched on the bar in a row like a flock of evil little birds who had horrible plans for him. Merlin smirked and kicked her feet back and forth, Zeldris rolled his eyes, and Estarossa merely looked mischievous. "Business as usual then, don't you have to run the bar tonight?" Merlin inquired innocently. "Well, when you put it like that, I don't trust you whatsoever, but okay." "Yeah," he agreed, narrowing his eyes warily at her. All 3 of them sat straighter, looking as innocent as it was possible for them to look, which wasn't very innocent at all. "Zeldris, I honestly thought better of you." "What the fuck? So either help or keep out of the way, alright? We're not actually kids, you know," Zeldris huffed, hopping off of the bar. Well, I have my doubts about Estarossa, but hey. Meliodas narrowly resisted the urge to bang his head against the wall as Estarossa followed his younger brother, Merlin snickering with an undoubtedly evil glee. I'm not a child, but you are remarkably childish, Merlin argued, and yeah, that wall was going to have a lot of dents in it by the time the night was over. He shook his head with a snort and grabbed the broom from where it leaned against the bar, heading back out to the seating area to tidy up. Please don't do anything crazy, he silently pleaded. His adopted younger sister glanced back as if she'd heard his thoughts, a gleam in those cat-like golden eyes of hers, and he groaned under his breath as she followed the boys into the kitchen. That is not the look of someone who isn't going to do anything crazy. Shoving his trepidation aside, he set to the, admittedly kind of daunting, task of cleaning up the tavern, sweeping the dust into little piles before burning it away with an ember of black fire. While Ban, surprisingly, kept his kitchen nearly spotless, the others were more inclined to create sprawling messes that were only cleaned up before opening time. And opening time was now just an hour or so away, and why the fuck had King let Oslo in here? The Black Hound had slobbered over everything. Everything. Next time, King, you're cleaning up after him, he muttered, fetching a wet dish rag and scrubbing at it with a sigh. Still, he could feel a smile spreading over his face. He'd missed this. Missed running the tavern and providing people a place where they could sit and talk. It had been because of a need for information that he'd bought it in the first place, but he'd genuinely come to love it, to miss it when it was gone and be happy when it came back. It was something he'd never been able to do as a demon prince or even as a knight, to make something with his own two hands rather than tearing it down, to make people happy instead of angry or devastated, to provide safety and comfort instead of fear and uncertainty. The boar hat was kind of famous now too, which meant more customers and more time doing what he loved. There was no noise from the kitchen, so he figured everything was fine and kept going, wiping down the bar before polishing the tankards. He even started humming as he went, pausing to pour himself a glass of water, because even if it took him ages to get drunk, he wasn't about to risk it when he was watching three not actual children and running a bar, and gazing proudly over his tavern. The walls were noticeably bare of anything but lanterns, but he planned to fix that by painting murals on the walls. Of what, he wasn't sure yet. Gowther and Escanor probably had a lot of ideas. They were the artists of the group. But he had the paint and the plan and the time and… well, fate seemed to be on his side for once. He grinned, taking a sip of the water, and choked on it as a yell of, "Merlin, what the fuck?" rang through the room. What in the… glass of water forgotten, he rounded the line of shelves that hid the kitchen from view, skidding to a halt and scanning the room frantically, immediately assuming the worst. He'd heard of what happened to Belialoween, how she'd caused its destruction, and if she'd somehow tricked Estarossa and Zeldris into doing something that made them angry enough to recreate that carnage. Well, he certainly didn't want to shove them to the ground again, but he would. And if she hurt them, I won't fail to protect them. Never again. Of course, when he saw it, he quickly comprehended that it wasn't remotely as bad as his instincts assured him it was. On the other hand, what had actually happened was completely and utterly ridiculous, and his brain was quietly telling him that it could not be possible, knowing how they felt about being regarded as children. Except it was both possible and ridiculous, and it had actually happened, and all he could do was stare for a good few minutes. Merlin had somehow, he didn't want to actually know how, appended a pot of leftovers prepared by Ban for the custom as meals. Because even you couldn't fuck up something as simple as heating food. He grinned, and Meliodas had chucked a mug at him good-naturedly, over Zeldris's head, presumably with Esteros's help, judging from how he was laughing uproariously in the corner. His youngest brother was fuming, dark magic rolling off him in waves even as something that looked like gravy dripped down his face, one black eye twitching as the pure darkness collected behind him and formed claw-like wings. Okay, I'm not going to ask what happened because I'm fairly sure I already know, Meliodas huffed, crossing his arms. Authoritative, like you're ordering the Sins as their captain, not your siblings as their babysitter. Hell, this makes it official. Except Merlin never listened to him unless there was something in it for her. Estarossa never listened to anyone regardless, and Zeldris was used to giving orders, not taking them. Brilliant. The three people who ignore authority the most in the same room with the brother they already resented. Oh, gods, Elizabeth, save me. Merlin, I honestly expected better. You're older than Leon's itself, not 6. I look 6, she grinned. That's not an excuse, you little. I look like I'm 15, but I don't act like it, he retorted. Merlin rolled her eyes and Meliodas huffed again, glancing at Estarossa. I have no clue why I expected better from you, Rosa, but I did. And Zeldris? Not one word, his brother hissed between gritted teeth. Not one word. He raised his hands in surrender. I was going to say go clean yourself up, but sure. The glare that comment earned him was nothing short of vicious, but he'd seen worse from all manner of creatures stronger than Zeldris, so he shrugged as the black-haired demon whipped around and marched out of the room. As for you two, clean up the mess you made. We open in 20 minutes and I need to start cooking. Please, spare us, Estarossa muttered, and Meliodas genuinely considered punching him in the throat to shut him up, before sighing and trotting back out to the front. Happy place, happy place, happy place, happy place. The wall was looking exceedingly good right about now, but he squared his shoulders, grabbed the towel, and set to polishing the tables until he could see his own reflection in them. He got through about half of them before another yell filled the air, this one strangely muffled. Meliodas stopped moving the towel, which was practically a rag at this point, worn through from many years of usage, resting his head on the cool wood before exhaling roughly. What the hell have you done now, Merlin? He murmured, because really, who else could be the culprit? Before lifting his head and re-entering the kitchen. It can't be as bad as what she did before, he reassured himself, squeezing his eyes shut before opening them cautiously. Surely not. And then, oh great, it's worse. Merlin, perched right next to the stove. That's dangerous, too dangerous. She could get hurt or die. He managed to shut those strange, overprotective instincts up before they overran him, focusing on the armor of his exasperation. After all, she was nearly as ancient as he was, and almost as powerful. There was no need to fear her proximity to a stove, then why die? He wondered, and was grinning like the cat who ate the canary, golden eyes glittering like she knew something he didn't. She spun a test tube in her hand as she did so, humming cheerfully. And Estarossa? Estarossa was nowhere to be found. Where is he? Somehow, he managed to keep his voice from hitching slightly. As horrible as Estarossa had been, and he'd been absolutely awful, the man was still his little brother and someone who had sided with him when it had counted most. And even if he hadn't, Meliodas would still move to protect him, because it was instinct in his nature, horrible and cruel as a demon's nature could be, as he had been, was to protect the people that were his. Estarossa had been the first person who he'd considered part of his family, and Zeldris the second, and then the Sins. Family. He'd never had the nerve to say it out loud, afraid they'd be taken from him again. Most things were, but it was true. Where is he? He growled, and he could feel the darkness forming a shadowy aura around him. Merlin apparently had the good sense to look mildly apologetic. He got irritating, so. She shrugged playfully, then tossed the test tube at him. Catch, Meliodas. His shadows snatched it out of the air for him, cradling it with as much delicacy and finesse as Ban wielded a kitchen knife. He pulled on the magic, dropping the tube gently into his hands, and stared. Again, Estarossa hammered on the glass, black eyes like saucers and mouth wide open as he screamed in fear and fury. His brother, in a test tube. He wasn't sure whether to laugh or throw Merlin through a window. He chose instead to open the tube, letting his brother out, before setting his gaze on the bored-looking sin of gluttony. She huffed, looking put out, as if she had something to be upset about when she'd trapped someone else in a tiny glass bottle. The magic imprisoning his little brother vanished, and the test tube broke as he was thrown unceremoniously onto the floor, gasping for air. Did Merlin not understand what suffocation was, for the gods' sakes? Meliodas helped him up with a sigh. You okay? Wanna stab her? Sorry, Rosa, but that violates the terms of agreement when it comes to staying at the boar hat. His brother grumbled, hiding his face in his arm, and he huffed. I'll handle Merlin, don't worry. Go check on Zell. But, you owe me for killing me. Estarossa rolled his eyes. You call that one thing in every time. Because you actually killed me, Meliodas reminded him, earning a dark look. Don't give me that, because you did and it kind of freaking hurt. And my coming back doesn't negate the fact that I died and everything went to shit while I was gone, so you owe me for basically the rest of your life. Now shoo. He gave him a gentle shove, and the silver-haired demon scoffed before trotting off. Now that that's sorted, Merlin, what the actual fuck? She shrugged. It's odd, isn't it? The others take on childish forms and are treated like actual children as well, but doing it to me? After everything I've done for your crusade? That's just rude, Captain. Despite her irritated words, she didn't look at all angry, just mischievous. So, it's business as usual. Of course, as my childhood was largely spent doing the same things I do now. Tricking people, mocking people when they fall for your tricks, manipulating everyone you meet. He ticked them off on his fingers as he spoke, mentally casting about for more. So, I figured that I may as well act like an ordinary child. Merlin gave him another wicked, cat-like grin. And don't children play pranks? I must say, it's rather fun. I think I'll stay like this for a while. Okay, first off, ordinary kids don't put people in test tubes. Meliodas was barely resisting the urge to slam his head against the wall again and again until he finally knocked himself unconscious. Second, if you're going to act like a kid, you're going to be properly treated like one, so. He drew himself upright, taking a deep breath. I can't believe I'm doing this. I'm going to sound like Bartra, of all people. Go to your room. My what? She sounded appropriately affronted, raising her dark eyebrows as she stared him down. Your room, your lab, whatever. He ran his fingers through his hair, grimacing. Oh, gods, I sound ridiculous. Seriously, Merlin, this isn't your base of operations anymore. The war's over and it's an actual, functioning tavern, and I would like to be able to run it again. Please. She looked miffed. I don't think so. Elizabeth, look what you've left me with. Look, I'm going to actually cry. Gods, what a mess. With a sigh, he wove raw shadow magic around his hand before wrapping it around Merlin. She let out an undignified yelp and immediately started clawing at it. Okay, so this seems to be working. Maybe we'll all get out of this in one piece. Or, he thought, already on the second floor and watching in horror as she absolute cancelled his magic out and started rummaging through the nearest storage closet, humming, not. What's most likely to get her to stop? What's she afraid of? Me, Merlin, he snapped, letting the shadows rise, forming markings on his skin. She glanced up at him, blinking innocently, and froze as his eyes flashed deepest black. So now she gets it. Great. Why does it always come down the fear tactics? Just stay out of the way. Please. He could see her weighing the pros and cons, the calculations flickering in those golden eyes as she tilted her head, crossing her arms. The boar symbol on her neck seemed to burn red, giving him another idea, and he added, Captain's orders. Merlin huffed again. If I must, she grumbled before stalking off, still managing to look regal and all-knowing, somehow, towards her lab, looking for all the world as though it had been her decision to leave. Meliodas couldn't even find it in himself to be irritated, simply sinking down against the wall with a sigh of relief. Surely it can't get any worse than this. For a while, it seemed as though everything was fine. There was enough food left from what Ban had made that the customers, of which there were many, people standing when they couldn't find tables or bringing their own stools, were kept happy. His selection of booze was declared by the nearby city's food critic as the greatest in the land. The chatter was constant and the brawls were few and far between. The few fights that did crop up were easily diffused by a quick chat with both parties, and everything seemed peaceful. Best of all, he hadn't heard a single complaint from any of the three, horrible, awful, cruel, not really children upstairs. In hindsight, that should have been what tipped him off. Instead, it was the complaint of a young woman whose coat was stolen on the way there, only to find it returned in an unflattering color. It's quite odd, he overheard her telling her friend. I was just walking up here, and I brought it since it's supposed to get chilly tonight when bam. It vanished out of my arms, like the night had snatched it away. And I'd spent so long saving up for it, too. She shook her head with a sigh, and her friend squeezed her shoulder. And then it was dropped on my head in an awful lime green. I look terrible in lime green, and I can't return the coat to the tailor, either. Thieves, maybe? Or some kind of sprites? I'll set up some wards around the boar hat tomorrow, just in case. He poured the poor woman a tankard of his best ale, murmuring, on the house, as she wrapped her hands around the mug with a grateful smile. He offered a quick grin in response before hurrying back to the kitchen, pulling the next order from the oven and trotting back out into the tavern. Meliodas set a meat pie down in front of the man who'd ordered it, snorting at a joke that another patron sitting at the same table told, before pausing as the voice of someone behind him rang in his ears. Swear something tripped me on my way up here. There were no brambles or anything, but when I tried to walk around this big puddle, something shoved me straight into it. The man grimaced, and he noticed for the first time that his shirt was dripping with mud. Could have sworn I heard laughter, too. Ghosts, maybe? Nah, man, it was probably the wind, his companion shrugged. Least it's warm and dry in here, right? Yeah? That sense of uneasiness grew, but he shook it off and started taking orders from the newcomers. Sprites and spirits are easy. Maybe I should set up those wards today. But the rumors kept coming and the weird feeling grew, until he was barely focusing and a man suggested, not unkindly, but the sympathy still made heat rush to his cheeks until he was certain he was blushing. A rare enough occurrence that he let another employee take over until he could clear his head. No, I'm fine, he managed, before swearing as the smell of burnt food reached his nostrils. Oh, fuck. Ah, the man remarked from where he sat at the bar, watching as Meliodas rushed into the kitchen and pulled the stew free of the stove. Only one working tonight, him? Dark eyebrows quirked upwards as he returned to the front of the tavern, aching from the few hours worth of trying to do what he'd done alone for so long, and failing. Failing, for the first time in ages, at running this restaurant he loved. The thought was enough to make tears spring to the exhausted demon's eyes, but he forced them back and squared his shoulders. Come on, man, if you could run the boar hat alone for 10 straight years, you can run it alone for a few more hours. Yeah, but I can handle it. He gave the man a weak grin. Anything I can get you? A snort came from him. No, it's enough to be out of the cold and you've clearly got enough on your plate. I suggest that you take a bit of time to rest. Owning a restaurant, running it alone, that can be draining. I've struggled with it myself. Gods, this man was a fucking saint. He took a moment to mentally thank the fates for sending this one understanding customer his way, before closing his eyes a moment. But I've got to keep going. Meliodas shook his head. No, it's just not normally this busy. It's gotten a little bit famous since the war ended. One of my waitresses kept it up and running when demons were ravaging everything and people spread the word, and now. He shrugged. I love it. Bought it myself, helped rebuild it, but I forgot how hard it is to handle alone. Out of practice, I guess. And distracted? He got an amused look. Those rumors of ghosts flying around, well, it's just say I've seen something as well. A girl, maybe 6, being carried by the night itself, except she had a tattoo on her neck. Sound familiar? Meliodas blinked, before tightening his grip on the bar's polished, knotted wood, barely suppressing a growl. God damn it. And then he was off and running, throwing the dish rag aside as he flung the door open and pelted into the night. Those brats, he seethed as he ran, shadows writhing around him. I am going to kill them for this. Fuck, I shouldn't even be chasing after them. I should just lock the windows when they come looking for food and tell them to suck it because they don't fucking deserve it. A giggle that sounded suspiciously like Merlin came from behind him, and he whirled around, baring his teeth. Golden eyes flashed in the darkness and vanished as he changed direction, speeding up. And fuck, there's no one left in the tavern, damn it, who cares? Another snicker sang through the air and he spun, feeling like an idiot, as moonlight glimmered off of silvery hair and disappeared. Oh, I am going to kill them. I'm going to kill them all. Except for the first time in what was a long history of victories and losses and wild hunts, his quarry escaped him again. And again, and again and again until he was fairly sure that they had returned to the boar hat and that he was lost in the forest like the idiot they'd made of him. The lights of his tavern glittered, looking incredibly far away even though the customers were gone, and Elizabeth. The mere thought of her name relieved some of his exhaustion, and he stood, brushing himself off with a sigh and starting the seemingly impossible journey to that warm, open door. Tonight had been an absolute disaster. But he was pretty sure he could cobble together a congratulatory cake for her success. He had no doubt that she'd succeeded. Surely even he couldn't screw up cake, he thought, stumbling into the comforting surroundings of the boar hat. It looked a bit okay, ransacked, but Elizabeth's long blue coat, the one he'd bought for her, dignified and elegant and perfect for her, was hanging on the coat rack that King had pestered him to put up. I'm home, he murmured and grinned reluctantly because despite everything, he was. The grin, however, was wiped off of his face as soon as he stood outside the door to his and Elizabeth's shared room and could hear the conversation within. It sounded like Elizabeth was, of all the ridiculous things, reading a story. Death or glory, yelled Gobber. Death or glory. yelled 8 boys back at him fanatically. Death, thought Hiccup and Fishlegs, sadly. Sounds remarkably like you when training first started, huh, Zell? Shut up, Esterosa. I almost don't believe it. Merlin's voice, now, amused and tired and bright despite all that shit she just put him through, and stop, you're going to end up strangling her at this rate, he scolded himself, tightening his fingers around the doorknob. Zeldris the Executioner, the 10 Commandments piety, son of the Demon King, is curled up next to his sworn enemy and listening to her read a bedtime story. He could picture Zeldris flushing bright red at that, a sleepy but mischievous grin crossing Esterosa's face, but Elizabeth's voice floated through the door again, a silvery laugh filling the air and effectively dispelling the, admittedly kind of adorable, image. He shuddered, feeling indignant. How come she can get them to sit quietly? This is unfair and awful, and they should be sleeping on the floor. For a week, at least. Rude little brats. Leave him alone, Merlin, and stop acting like you're not enjoying the story as well. Yeah, shush, Merlin, Esterosa chimed in, sounding sleepy. You are the one talking. Shush, Elizabeth repeated, and he pictured her running her fingers through Merlin's hair soothingly, lulling the 3 of them to sleep. Quote ellipsis. Gobber paused dramatically with the horn to his lips. Meliodas listened to her read, listened to Esterosa's yawns turn to quiet snores, to Merlin's soft murmurings about dragons turning into peaceful silence, Zeldris' breathing slowing. He knew instinctively that this was one of the first nights that they'd slept without nightmares, one of the first true rests they'd had since the war's end, and his resentment lessened a bit. I'm glad, but they didn't have to ruin my bar to get tired enough to sleep properly, damn them. With a sigh, he pushed the door open, making sure not to turn the lights on as he entered, his gaze falling on Elizabeth. She looked tired, but fulfilled, her blue eyes glowing in the half-light with the kind of euphoria only success could bring. I assume you succeeded? He murmured, casting a glance towards the bed. A novel rested on the small bedside table, a page marked down on it, maybe for a future reading session? Will their pride even allow it? He wondered, glancing at them, and a small smile crossed his face despite his annoyance. Merlin was nestled into Elizabeth's right side, small fingers knotted into the sleeve of her tunic. Zeldris was curled up on her left, his head pressed against her shoulder with Esterosa sprawled out and snoring quietly next to him. It's kind of cute, I guess. Not that I've forgiven them, of course. Elizabeth gave him a wide smile. Absolutely. She stroked Zeldris's hair absent-mindedly, then pulled back, seemingly realizing what she was doing. I assume from their tales of triumph that things weren't quite as good here. Speaking of which, I have no idea why you're letting them sleep in our bed after the trouble they caused. He leaned over his brothers, kissing Elizabeth on the cheek. Never leave me alone with them again. We might have to, she warned mischievously, and he groaned with not entirely mock horror. I can wake them up and ask them to move, if you'd like. He glanced over them, 3 children, not 3 warriors. 3 kids that had been forced to grow up too fast over the millennia, who seemed to finally be able to relax, who had never had the chance to properly be children and were now trying to figure out what that was like. Nah, let them sleep. I'll deal with the bastards in the morning. He waved a hand dismissively before pulling some blankets out of the closet, shooting another glance at them over his shoulder as he did. Her eyes glittered, and he grinned reluctantly, gaze sweeping over the 3. You're a good man, Meliodas, she murmured, and he leaned in and kissed her good night before heading downstairs. He trotted into the kitchen, folding up the blankets before lying down on them, staring up at the ceiling. A good man. For the first time in, well, ages, Meliodas believed it. Why do I feel so damn uncomfortable? Squinting against the early morning glare, Meliodas began to stretch out his limbs to greet to the day, feeling aches run through his body in response. Surely I've not been tied up again? Unlikely. Hawk was absent, no doubt moving to third base with his sow, and Elizabeth had long since abandoned this particular nonsense, even when he'd done something stupid. Meliodas stretched out an arm experimentally, no ropes, thank goodness, then realization hit him as the events of the previous day flooded back. He was sleeping on the floor. The children who were not really children had taken over his bed. This is the last time. Meliodas stood, determined to give his brothers and Merlin what for. The sight on the bed that greeted him, however, was not what he expected. Rather than two, admittedly small but still fully grown, adult demons, terrorizers of Britannia and former commandments, lay two tiny actual children, curled up against one another, chests rising and falling in sleep. Silver and black hair was mussed up, spread out over the pillows and the demons' small faces, but their snub noses were still visible, confirming their identities. What the actual fuck? Eyes raking over the bed, Meliodas bit hard on his tongue to stop himself from yelling. Perturbed as he was, he did not want to wake up Esterosa or Zeldris. Change then back, now. Meliodas growled as Merlin sat up on the bed, golden eyes glinting with her amusement as a smile curved over her lips. I don't think so, Merlin giggled, her hands folded on her lap as she sat crossed-legged next to Elizabeth. You were treating them like children, so now that's what you've got. I'm teaching you a lesson. Do it, or I'll get someone else to do it for you. You don't think you're the only one in Britannia who knows absolute cancel? Meliodas glared at Merlin, hands on hips, his voice coming in a hushed whisper despite his annoyance. Oh really, who else can do it then? Merlin asked innocently, staring back. Damn. No one. Chandler had been annihilated during the Holy War. Vivian had perhaps mercifully perished before the real action had even started, and Gilthunder, in his infinite wisdom, had outlawed the production of spell beads on taking charge of Leones. I told him it was a stupid idea. Zeldris can do it. It might take him a bit of time to learn the spell, but… You don't think they have any magic, do you? Merlin asked in mock surprise. I took care of that. Can't have children with power running around. Head suddenly swimming, Meliodas's legs gave way and he sat down on the bed. The movement was enough to jostle the two sleeping demons. They looked about 8 and 5 in human years. And they both started groaning and rubbing their eyes. Esterosa was the first to react. Cool, he said as if awestruck, examining his hands, grinning excitedly at Merlin, who cackled with laughter in return. Zeldris looked around, first at Esterosa, then Meliodas, face as black as thunder, and burst into tears, fat salty droplets streaming down his face. The commotion was enough to rouse Elizabeth, who, despite not being fully awake, instinctively wrapped her arms around the sobbing child. It's all right, Elizabeth murmured softly, holding the little boy close to her as she quickly appraised the situation. Giving Merlin a careful look, causing the girl to look momentarily slightly, only slightly, damn her, ashamed of herself, Elizabeth hopped off the bed, ushering Esterosa and Zeldris along with her. We'll all feel a lot better after breakfast. Come on, let's get you something to eat. I'm not having anything he cooks, Esterosa whined as he pointed at his eldest brother. Last time I did that I was sick. The silver-haired boy shoved a finger down his throat and made gagging voices, much to Merlin and Zeldris's amusement, both of them dissolving into fits of giggles. Ungrateful shits. You don't have to. Ban and Elaine came back last night. Meliodas, will you go wake Ban up, please? Elizabeth looked at him sweetly, and Meliodas felt his gratitude to her swell in his. He desperately needed a break from whatever this was. Walking slowly up the stairs of the boar hat, keen to prolong his absence from his dysfunctional family, Meliodas inevitably reached the door he was looking for far earlier than he would have liked and entered without knocking as usual. Hey Ban, you're back early. What? Before he could continue, Meliodas felt a wind rush past him as Ban sped off the bed and tugged him unceremoniously by the shoulder out of the room, before shutting the door softly behind him. Be quiet, would you? Elaine's just got to sleep and she's feeling pretty rough. That's why we came home, Ban explained in a whisper, his crimson eyes boring into his friend. Now, you need something, Cap'n? Yeah, breakfast, now. Just come and make pancakes. You'll see why when you get there. Please don't ask questions, my sanity can't take it. Ban looked at his friend closely, noting the set of his jaw before nodding slowly, his shoulders relaxing as he led the way down to the kitchen, Meliodas following behind. The sight that met their eyes in arriving in the bar was enough to send Meliodas's head into a spin. Tables and stools had been pulled over and dragged to the center of the room. A very small Esterosa stood on top of the huge pile of furniture, holding an imaginary sword up in the air. This is my land. Intruders will be Elimi, done away with. Enter at your own risk. The boy yelled, one hand on his hip and his mouth in a pout as his charcoal eyes glowered at Ban and Meliodas. Ban took one look at the demon in miniature and the makeshift fort before bursting into laughter, striding to Esterosa with his long legs and poking the kid hard in the stomach with a long, bony finger. He wiggled it slightly, and before Meliodas knew what was happening, Esterosa was laughing and squirming as Ban tickled him, the pile of tables and stools threatening to topple to the cobbled stone floor below with the disturbance. "Hey, no fair, he's attacking the general." "Merlin, sick, I am," Zeldris commanded as he crawled out of the mess of furniture, standing in front of Ban, arms folded across his chest as he glared. Merlin too extricated herself from the mass of wood and, a grin of wicked delight on her face, started to mutter some words under her breath. "Now, there's no need for that," Elizabeth said gently as she placed a hand on Merlin's shoulder. The girl looked up, a calculating look flashing across her features before she acquiesced, taking hold of Elizabeth's hand and kicking one leg back and forth, the picture of innocent girlhood. "Who does she think she's fooling?" "Ban, I think some food would be useful. Would you mind making something quick? And not too much sugar," Elizabeth added sotto voce into Ban's ear as he headed towards the kitchen. "They're hyper enough as it is." Ban grinned in reply, before whispering something into Elizabeth's ear. With a quick look of understanding, the goddess set off up the stairs, her silver hair swaying as she moved. "Where is she off to? Don't leave me on my own again with them, please." Soon the sound of clanking bowls and the crackling of frying filled the bar, and Meliodas, unsure of what else to do, set about returning the interior to its usual state, or as close as they could manage. "I was gone for 10 minutes. How could they possibly have done all of this?" The worn rag hung on its usual hook, and Meliodas started wiping down the tables, the habit of the action soothing his jagged nerves as the 3 laughing children ran around him, squealing. It was like Hawk was home, only even noisier. "All right, breakfast," called Ban as he plonked 3 plates down on the bar. The children instantly stopped their game, at last some peace, and hopped up onto adjacent stools, Merlin immediately cramming large mouthfuls of the meal into her face. "What is this?" Esterosa asked pointedly, poking the food on the plate with his fork. "Blueberry pancakes with honey. Eat up," Ban replied, leaning an elbow on the bar and grinning broadly. Meliodas stopped tidying the area and stepped over to join his friend. He had to see this. Demon children were not often given much besides dragon meat in the early years, and he was intrigued to see how his brothers would react. Experimentally, Zeldris picked up a blueberry, scrunching up his face in disgust before licking it. Evidently reassured that it was not poisonous, he popped it in his mouth, his whole face morphing into an enormous smile as he did so. He started to eat the pancakes in earnest, even catching up with Merlin before she had finished. Esterosa, still unconvinced, pushed his plate to one side, his expression sullen. "The policy on food here is simple. Take it or leave it," Meliodas said with a grin as Esterosa made groaning noises. "There's nothing else until lunchtime." Defeated, Esterosa shoved a mouthful of pancake into his mouth, trying and failing to hide his obvious enjoyment. Very soon, the plates were cleared and the 3 actual children looked up at Meliodas expectantly. Why don't you 3 go and play outside for a bit? You've got no powers, right? You need to train," Meliodas suggested, albeit a bit weakly. "Just get out of my bar, right now. We'll call you when it's time to come in." Expecting resistance, Meliodas was relieved and suspicious when the 3 small balls of mischief rushed out of the bar, laughing their heads off. Looking out of the diamond-patterned windows, Meliodas saw the children running round the flower-dusted field outside of the boarhat, engaged in what appeared to be some type of chase. "So, Cap'n, wanna share what the fuck is going on here, Tilda?" Ban asked with mock indignation, his canines glinting in the morning light. "It's Merlin, she's..." Meliodas ground to a halt as darkness began to bleed over his forehead, his eyes glowing black with his anger. "This is all her fault." "Yeah, I figured. So what are we going to do? Or are you going to babysit them until they grow up? How long will that take, by the way?" Ban's languid leer took on an evil edge as he watched his friend crumble, the darkness blending to skin as Meliodas hid his face in his hands. "Centuries," he whispered. "It takes about 250 years for demons to reach maturity. I'd say Esteros is about 45 now, Zeldris isn't even 20. Fuck, how does your race cope? I thought 16 years was bad enough," Ban cackled. "That's only the high-ranking demons. The foot soldiers are born ready for battle, so there's no difficulty there. High-ranking demons are sent away until they're old enough to be useful." You come back when you're about 150 years old and start proper training. It's pretty intensive, so there's no time for mischief. There are targets to meet. Returning to the task of setting the bar back to order as Ban returned to the kitchen, quite some time passed before Meliodas stared out of the window, suddenly concerned by the lack of noise. He scoured the landscape. Merlin was sitting on the branch of a tree swinging her legs back and forth, again with the innocence thing. Didn't she realize that absolutely no one was falling for it? But there was no sign of the two boys. Where the fuck are they? Heart sinking, Meliodas rushed out of the door to stand in front of the little girl. You won't find them here, Merlin said lightly as she deliberately shredded a leaf with her tiny fingers. They went on a hunt, I don't know where. It's all very boring, that rubbish. But, how? They're just kids. What are they hoping to catch? Meliodas gripped onto the trunk of the tree to prevent his knees from giving way. This is a nightmare. I'll wake up soon. Merlin shrugged before returning to the leaf, carefully peeling back the dark green material from the delicate veins of the plant. Stretching out his powers, Meliodas searched the land for any sign of his brothers. This was not easy. Their post-transformation signature was incredibly weak and he closed his eyes to try and pick up the smallest trace of their power. At last he caught something, the slightest impression of demonic energy coming from the nearby fields. Wasting no time, Meliodas ran towards it, the branches of the trees bending backwards with the force of his movement. His green eyes scanned the landscape, but though he must be in the right area he could see nothing. This was a fool's errand. Then all at once a fierce roar filled the air, the unmistakable howl of an angry dusk bison. Not too dangerous a foe in normal circumstances but more than enough to destroy two idiot children. Quick as a flash, Meliodas sped towards the animal, hoping he was not too late to prevent a disaster. The sight that met his eyes when he reached it was more than enough to make his head swim with concern. Is that all you got? Zeldris yelled as he stood directly in front of the charging orange hulk, his red suit goading the animal to new heights of rage. Come and get me, you oaf! The beast bellowed in fury, cantering towards the small boy, blowing hot breath from its nose as the ground shuddered under its hooves. Not good. Definitely not good at all. Zeldris stood stock still as the mass of anger approached, his expression one of delighted glee. Meliodas was on the point of plucking the boy out of harm's way when, without warning, a flash of blue and silver fell from a nearby tree right onto the back of the charging beast. With a shout of triumph, Estarossa grabbed the dusk bison by the horns, pulling its head backwards up towards the sky, digging his knees sharply into the animal's flank. The beast bucked violently, trying to shake off the intruder, but Estarossa held his ground. Undeterred, the beast continued on its path towards Zeldris, head held down as far as it could as if prepared to charge. Before Meliodas could process what was happening, Zeldris picked up a sturdy stick from the ground, the end of it sharpened to a vicious point. In one fluid movement, Zeldris thrust the makeshift spear into the animal's throat, pushing it in as far as it would go. The beast spluttered in pain, before falling to the ground, Estarossa jumping off its back as it thudded into the dirt. Zeldris approached their prey and yanked his spear out of its neck, checking that it was completely dead as he did so. With a grin, the two boys gave each other a high five as they surveyed their kill. That was easy, Estarossa said as he brushed off his coat. The brat was actually worried about his goddamn coat and not the fact that he could have died right fucking there. Don't know what the fuss is all about with these things. The fuss is that you could have been killed. Meliodas yelled as his voice finally returned to him and he ran towards his two brothers, who looked up at him in surprise as he approached. Do you have any idea how dangerous those things can be? Not much, Zeldris said, his chest puffed up with pride. That was nothing. We could take 10 of those, no 20. What were you thinking? You have no powers, no weapons, and why? Whatever possessed you? Meliodas ground his teeth together as he struggled to control his anger, suppressing the urge to swipe the satisfied expression off Zeldris's face. We wanted something decent for lunch, that's all, Estarossa grumbled as he hopped off the carcass. And we had a weapon. It took a while to make that, he added sulkily, gesturing at the stick Zeldris was still holding. We're not stupid. Attacking a dusk bison, on your own, with nothing but a pointy stick? Stupid is exactly what you are. And this is your fault, Estarossa. You're the elder one, it's your job to look out for Zeldris, not to lead him into obvious danger. Well, excuse me, Esterosa said, fuming, forgive me for following your example. You took me on an hunt when I was barely born, remember? And I nearly got killed. That was different, Meliodas growled, but he found he could not maintain eye contact. It had been a risky enterprise, probably riskier than dealing with the dusk bison. I was an adult, more than capable of protecting you. How would you have saved Zeldris exactly if that beast hadn't succumbed? Can we just go home? Zeldris whined, interrupting the argument. I'm tired. As if to prove the point, the young boy yawned widely before promptly sitting down on the ground, pouting up at his eldest brother. Angry as he was, Meliodas could not help himself smile as he looked at the pale petulant face which stared back up at him. Fine, get on my shoulders. I'll carry you back, Meliodas said, and Zeldris hopped on, laughing with delight as he grabbed handfuls of messy golden hair to steady himself. With a grunt, Meliodas picked up the enormous dusk bison and started the journey back towards the boarhat, Esterosa following at his side. How come he gets a ride? This is favoritism, Esterosa complained as they trudged. Although he had not noticed it in his rush to find the pair, Meliodas realized they were some distance from the bar. It would take a while to get there at this pace. Ignoring his brother, who he decided did have a point, Meliodas continued in silence towards his home, fighting the urge not to deposit Zeldris on the ground as the young boy slipped two small hands over his eyes. Merlin had to change these two back soon, or he would not be responsible for his actions. The question was how to persuade her. Zeldris was about 95% sure that the universe had it out for him at this point. Losing the war hadn't convinced him of this, of course, but being banned from the demon realms for being a traitor, as if he hadn't done more than anyone to restore their clan to their former glory, those traitorous snakes, and forced to move in with his brother's absolutely insane friends, that had come close. Merlin turning him into a 17-year-old demon, which Elizabeth said was about 5 for humans. Either way, he was extremely tiny and extremely pissed off, just happened to be the final straw. But, if he was going to be honest about it, it wasn't entirely bad. Sure, the lower pain threshold was annoying, he'd almost cried when he stubbed his toe. His toe? Who even did that? Well, maybe the new fairy king, who he'd caught in the middle of a swearing fit after doing the same, and the lack of power frustrated him beyond belief. And the fact that his first reactions were almost always extraordinarily childish was infuriating, but other parts of it were sort of tolerable. The food was definitely better than raw dragon meat. Esterosa had tried to convince Meliodas and Elizabeth otherwise a few nights ago, but the delicious stew had shut him up pretty quickly, and his father wasn't there as some omniscient, awful presence, and he didn't have to train for anything. He wasn't allowed near sharp things, or to go out hunting again ever. Meliodas had said it like that, warning sirens blaring even as he kept his voice low, but he could just run around, and talk, and exist. That was another weird thing about Meliodas's beloved sins. They didn't give orders outside of battle, and they didn't have regular training drills or anything of the sort. Meliodas asked them to do things, sure, but they could always say no. This concept was utterly bizarre, another human anomaly. How the hell did things get done without a chain of command? Without someone constantly in charge? The 10 Commandments would have been horribly dysfunctional without either him or the Demon King giving the orders, and Gloxinia and Duller probably would have changed sides a lot earlier, too. It should have been impossible. He was raised on orders hell, so was Meliodas himself. But this ragtag group of equals had obliterated the Demon Clan's army, had fought their way through thousands of elite soldiers and come out on top in almost every fight. It was weird, but it wasn't bad or anything. Just different. And kind of nice, too, when he realized that Ban would sneak them cookies, though not to Merlin, who'd always get sulky for a little bit and steal someone else's, even if his big brother told him not to, and that Diane and King would let him explore without Esterosa so long as Oslo was with him. They'd found a stream the last time, with all sorts of interesting rocks and a crumbling wall that looked like it was from a castle. It was especially fun when King's sister snuck into their room despite being told explicitly by King, Ban, and just about everyone to rest to tell them all sorts of stories about the Fairy King's forest. She defied all suggestion of taking it easy, insisting that spending time with the young demons was good practice. That last situation was rare, but she seemed very nice and very clever, too, maybe smarter than Gowther, who liked to read to them when Elizabeth was away or when Meliodas wanted them out of the tavern, Estarossa rarely paid attention, but he did, interested in the thousands of stories that the former commandment had committed to memory. One thing, however, annoyed Zeldris, confused him, mostly, but he was terrified of it and fear wasn't allowed because it made you weak and his father had no use for weakness. The most about this predicament, and he was pretty sure it was Merlin's fault, because making it her fault was easier than admitting to anything. The worst thing about it was that they all touched him, hugged him, ruffled his hair, hoisting him on their shoulders and giving good night kisses, of all things. Little, casual touches that made his head spin and warm feelings run through his body, feelings he hadn't asked for but didn't have the strength to lock down anymore. The frankly awful and irritating feelings had started or become noticeable, really after that night a few weeks ago, before they'd even been turned into children, when Elizabeth had been reading that story to them. He'd been caught up in it, surprised that humans could come up with such interesting concepts and intrigued by the little green dragon and the small freckle white boy that were the heroes of the tale. Demon stories weren't half as interesting, and they always included some sort of wild shedding of blood, or massacres or battles. No, the dragon story was refreshing and cool, and he'd been exhausted and had felt almost secure, with his brother on one side and Elizabeth on the other, her soothing voice washing over them. And she'd run her fingers through his hair, and the touch just made him feel sort of melty and weird, but not bad at all. It had gotten even worse after Merlin cursed them. After he'd had that humiliating reaction, he'd burst out crying without even thinking about it, his first instinct being to sob and hope that someone else would tell him how to fix it rather than doing what he always had and taking it on himself. Elizabeth had hugged him, and he'd let her, had craved the contact and the comfort and the warmth that emanated from her, all things that demons were supposed to ignore, to hate. Demons weren't supposed to want hugs or even like them, or let people run fingers through their hair, or press against people. Least of all reincarnated goddesses, in their sleep. They were supposed to be as cold as ice and sharp as steel, blades that their king would wield to conquer. But the touches kept coming. Ban would ruffle his hair as he passed, or Meliodas would loop an arm around his shoulders in a sort of sideways hug, or Elizabeth would give his hand a gentle squeeze as she walked by, or Diane would pick him up and squeeze him, squealing something about small, cute creatures. And he wanted to hate it so damn badly, but he couldn't, not even if he remained stiff and unyielding throughout the entire point of contact. It was like his body had the stupid idea that he wanted these sort of hugs and things. I don't, he thought indignantly, shuffling down the stairs to Esterossa's room. Elizabeth was going to read them another chapter of the Dragon Book, and they had just been getting to the best part, too, with the boy and the little green dragon about to take their special warrior tests, or whatever they were called, and he desperately wanted to know whether they would pass or not. Still, he hesitated just outside the door, frowning slightly. Should I even be doing this? I'm not 5, I'm a proper adult. Mentally. Full-grown demons don't listen to bedtime stories, especially ones that aren't about war or anything useful. Then Elizabeth opened the door, blinking down at him with warm blue eyes, and he found himself resisting the urge, the stupid urge, to lift his arms and quietly ask if she might pick him up. Just in time, she said with a chuckle. Esterossa's, impatient, an indignant cry rose from the bed where Estarossa sat, his older brother giving Elizabeth a disgruntled look. Zeldris was fairly sure that this was the point when he was supposed to make some sort of sarcastic comment about his brother being stupid, but a weird lump swelled up in his throat when he opened his mouth. Come on, he thought, resisting the urge to cringe as his heart sped up, a panicked thumping that made him feel weirdly ill. Just say something, anything, come on, you're the fucking executioner and you can't even say a word. Elizabeth's eyes seemed to soften, he couldn't really tell. He was starting to feel awfully dizzy and sick and he didn't even know why, and he managed to stifle a gasp as she took his hand. He let her lead him over to the bed where Estarossa waited, black eyes peering impatiently from under silver bangs, and didn't even protest. He wasn't sure if he actually could. His voice still didn't seem to be working and that sick and awful feeling was still pulling at his gut, when she picked him up and nestled him into her side. Where were we? She inquired, pulling out the book. Zeldris felt the nausea lessen as he watched her open the worn leather cover, and he cautiously pressed himself against her side as Estarossa cheered and bounced over to her. He had a distinct feeling that she knew exactly where they were in the story. He ignored it, instead trying to peer over her shoulder in order to see the familiar words carefully printed on the pages. Fingers wound through his hair a second later and he fought the urge to melt into her side and lean into the touch, instead shifting surreptitiously to the side and squeezing his eyes shut. "I don't like it," he repeated to himself. "I don't like it, I don't like it, I don't like it." He was going to those celebration thingies and was going to take that Viking warrior test or whatever it was called. His older brother grinned, still bouncing in place. Zeldris opened one eye cautiously as a laugh ran through Elizabeth's body. Why was his brother taking this so well? Why wasn't he upset at all? Why didn't he flinch when people were really loud or jump when people snuck up behind him? Why didn't he seem to immediately scan faces for disappointment and anger and all sorts of things that he shouldn't be bothered by? Was it because he was older? Or, is there something wrong with me? "I believe you're right," Elizabeth told Esterosa, the words echoing dully in Zeldris's ears and managing to pull him out of that deepening spiral of festering thoughts. He blinked, alarmed to find that his eyes felt watery. "No, no, no." He shook his head slightly, sucking in a shaky breath before resting his head hesitantly on her arm. She gave him a small, almost sad smile. She couldn't be sad because if she was sad that meant Meliodas would be angry at them and he wasn't sure that he had the strength to deal with that, if he'd ever had the strength at all. Before beginning to read, her sunshine warm voice washing over the room soothingly. The Thursday celebrations were a truly spectacular occasion. Zeldris found himself getting invested in the story again, the sick feeling becoming more of a dull ache as she kept reading aloud. Esterosa dozed off partway through the chapter. Ironic, he thought. Glad that he could feel annoyed about it rather than upset. The idiot wanted me to get down here so he could read it and then fell asleep before we even got to the good bit. Typical before actually falling asleep, soft snores punctuating each sentence, not loud enough that he couldn't hear the story, thank goodness. He was starting to feel tired as well, a ringing sensation blocking out most of the words, a heavy sensation forcing his eyelids down, down, down as her honey-smooth words washed over him. He let his eyes close, let himself start to slip away. "Well, don't expect me to pity you," said Hiccup. What kind of father thinks his stupid laws are more important than his own son? And what kind of stupid tribe is this, anyway, that it can't just have ordinary people in it? Elizabeth's voice didn't waver as she read the sentence, but to Zeldris it sounded like the clanging of a bell, loud and echoing and painful, snapping him out of his stupor with a gasping breath. "What I don't understand, why would he say that? He's going to get hurt. You don't say that to a king. No, 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 no." Stoic stood Zeldris? And then Elizabeth's worried face was in front of his, or above, he couldn't tell. Everything was going blurry and he couldn't breathe or think and things were flickering awful colors and the book was tucked under her arm. He realized belatedly that he was crying, that he didn't know when he'd started or why, which only made him cry harder and feel even worse. "Oh, gods, sweetheart, I'm so sorry." No, it hadn't been her fault. Or maybe it had been. He wasn't sure what to think anymore. Was he a demon or a human? A killer or a child? Commandment or sin or something different entirely? It was his fault for being weak and getting upset like a child. Elizabeth murmured softly and picked him up. He clung to the fabric of her shirt with a gasp, before burying his face in her shoulder with a low whimper. "Weak," his father's voice hissed in his ear. "Weak, worthless child. You can never compare to your brother, even that rat Esterosa is better than you." Elizabeth? Esterosa. His brother didn't understand, never had and never would. Father's eye had never been on him. He'd never been under that awful, analytical gaze as it picked out every mistake, every failure, every reason he wasn't a proper demon or wasn't good enough. He felt a sob bubble up in his throat and choked it down, desperately trying to be quiet so that his brother would not wake up fully. "Go back to sleep, Esterosa," Elizabeth soothed, and though her tone was gentle, her eyes were unyielding. His older brother gave a soft grumble, but he heard his body flop back against the mattress. Elizabeth's fingers ran through his hair again and he hiccuped, trying to force back another sob. He could feel her moving, but he didn't want to lift his head, to confront the reality that he was small and weak and sobbing over a line from a book because it reminded him of himself, too much of himself. The hinges creaked, so they were leaving, he thought dazedly, and a new voice, softer than he remembered it, managed to echo through the haze that choked his thoughts. What happened? Meliodas, he thought, and immediately wanted to hide away in the relative safety of Esterosa's room. Maybe Esterosa didn't know what being under his father's claws had done to him, but Meliodas did, and that was worse, because he'd try and talk to him about it and then his brother would know exactly how weak he was. "I was right," Elizabeth said after a moment, and he flinched, because her voice came out as a growl, an intimidating growl, like a wolf's as it stared down a challenger. Her grip on him tightened, faintly soothing and protective. "I was right." There was a beat of silence, and then she shifted him slightly. He clung to her shirt desperately, unwilling to look up and see the pity from everyone else and feel the tears streaming down his face. He felt her sigh, felt the vibrations in her throat as she said, "I read him this," Elizabeth said, and Zeldris felt her arms shift as she handed something to his brother. "And it wait, Meliodas." "Zell," his brother whispered, and he sucked in a shaky breath as he was suddenly passed from Elizabeth's arms to Meliodas's. A sob shuddered through him and he pushed at the stronger arms, at the 7 heartbeats that thudded with a dull, aching rhythm as more tears spilled fruitlessly down his cheeks. "No, stop, please. I don't want to talk, don't want to listen, please, please, please." He could hear footsteps, Elizabeth leaving, Elizabeth realizing that he was weak and worthless and pawning him off on the only person who would take him. Elizabeth going away and leaving him with the brother who blamed him for the deaths of Gloxinia and Dolar and probably just about everyone else. How many people had his soldiers killed in Camelot? How many? "Zeldris," Meliodas repeated, and there were hands in his hair, stroking and soothing and warm. "Zeldris, you're safe. He's 6 feet 1,000 feet under, and trust me, I've gone back to check." The pain in his brother's voice made him twist with guilt, and the warm grip tightened but gently, not painfully. It was almost as if Meliodas was actively trying not to hurt him, as if he wanted him safe. Demons aren't allowed to be safe, he thought, more than a bit hysterically. Demons are the worst nightmares of the other clans. They want us eradicated, not safe, and you serve them, and father wants us to fight, and I'm supposed to fight them all, kill them all, and I'm tired, so tired. He fought the urge to relax in his arms, shifting and stiffening and trying desperately to keep his tear-stained face hidden as Meliodas spoke again. "And while I've thought about digging him up and killing him slower for what he's done to everyone he ever touched, ever used and tossed away, used and tossed away, used and tossed away, used and tossed away." The words echoed with an horrible clang in Zeldris's head, and he felt tears, more tears, even though he'd never stopped crying, even though he seemingly couldn't stop press against his eyes. It's just, he's not worth the pain, not worth the cycle restarting. Life at the Boar Hat had returned to a semblance of normality, or as normal as a bar run by heroes with 3 actual children to care for in a ravaged, post-war Britannia can be. Mama Hawk meandered around, stopping at likely places so the Sins could earn the money they needed to help pay for food. Hunting was apparently still out of the question, and there was no shortage of customers. If anything, the prospect of seeing the 2 demon princes who had been so feared across the land, in miniature form, had drawn in the punters in droves. Zeldris had found this acutely annoying. As if it wasn't bad enough that he was still being picked up and hugged by all of Meliodas's crew, Harlequin aside, at least the Fairy King had some respect. Now the Boar Hat patrons were at it too, their forwardness usually lubricated with alcohol. Meliodas had tried to stop it, to be fair, but he was fighting a losing battle. The embarrassment, the shame, was enough to make Zeldris's cheeks flush bright red, usually earning more coups from the drunken revelers. The fact that he was too weak, too pathetic to hex them was a continued source of frustration. "If I had my power, you would not dare approach me." He could not understand how Esterosa could possibly be enjoying the experience so much. The silver-haired boy darted around, prattling sweetly, amusing all and sundry and getting sweets and the odd penny in return for his efforts. He was relishing the attention, and this made Zeldris even more cross. Did no one in his family have any pride left? They were like a traveling circus. Speaking of pride, the other thing of note was that Escanor had returned home too, having closed down his bar, cave, thing, successfully. He had brought quite a bit of odd stock back to the Boar Hat too, and Meliodas and Ban had experimented with the contents of the dusty bottles which Escanor had acquired while in exile. Zeldris had rolled his eyes, ridiculous behavior, but he had tried not to make his brother's life too hard since they had shared that moment in Meliodas's room. Although he did not want to say it out loud, Zeldris was more than thankful for his brother's love and protection. Truth be told, Zeldris had actually engineered reasons to spend time alone with Meliodas, and had been relieved to find that his eldest brother had welcomed his company. They had even gone fishing at one point, Meliodas helping him to reel in a trout which they'd shared before heading back home. It had tasted awful, of course, but that really didn't matter. Merlin on the other hand had different ideas. Since Escanor had found his way back to the bar, she had been even more insufferable, knowing that her unquestioning knight would break down any attempts to apply just punishment to her for her misdemeanors. No one crossed Escanor, not even Elizabeth. He was, temporarily, invincible after all. The goddess had tried to reason with the man, but he'd just taken off his glasses and glared at her as he towered above, arms folded across his chest in disdain when she tried to point out Merlin's shortcomings and the need for a regimen of discipline. "You will leave her alone," boomed the great voice as Zeldris ran into the boar hat, pretend sword in hand. He had grown used to the freedom allowed him, and now enjoyed exploring the fields around the bar on his own. He would have stayed out for longer, but it was nearly time for breakfast, and with band cooking that was not something to be missed. "I will hear no more on this subject," the loud voice continued as Zeldris stood stock still, willing himself not to tremble. For once, he could not fully blame his fear on his childlike state. He'd been frightened of Escanor since the human had so unaccountably totaled Estarossa. "You will heed my words or face the consequences, and you will apologize to the young lady for daring to interfere with your betters." "But Escanor," Elizabeth protested, her words sounding desperate, "last night you said—" "Never mind what that fool chose to convey when you spoke to him last. He is not worthy of an audience. I tell you now, the Lady Merlin is not for you to trifle with, and that is the end of the discussion." Zeldris shrank back into the shadows as Escanor strode across the bar and out of the door, his muscular legs whipping past as the still loose clothes fluttered in the breeze caused by his movements. He'd be out until dusk now, doing who knew what. "Zeldris, how long were you standing there?" Elizabeth asked as she came into the bar, looking decidedly put out. Zeldris began before his bottom lip quavered and he had to clench his fist to stop himself from crying. "It's not your fault," Elizabeth said gently, her hard features softening as she knelt down beside Zeldris and gave him a hug. "You must be hungry. I'll go fetch Ban, he's slept in this morning." "Well, what do you expect if he and Meliodas stay up all night drinking?" Zeldris thought as Elizabeth started to head up the stairs, but he didn't say anything. He had resisted it and tried to convince himself otherwise, but no matter how hard he tried it was no longer possible to pretend that he did not love Elizabeth. "Sappy." A mischievous voice sounded from above and Zeldris looked up to see Merlin floating in midair, her face alight with wickedness as she somersaulted around, her purple, lace-trimmed dress remarkably staying in position as she twirled and tumbled. "You'll be getting a reputation as a mummy's boy if you don't watch it. Why are you so mean to them?" Zeldris whined as he glared up at Merlin, heat flaming in his cheeks but pushing past the fear that she might tattle to Escanor. "You've definitely gone soft," Merlin grumbled as she sunk to the floor. "The fun's only just started. Just wait to see what me and Esta have planned for tonight." "What?" But before Zeldris could ask his question, Ban muddled into the room, groaning slightly as he ran his hand through his hair and made his way to the kitchen. Merlin flashed Zeldris a wild grin, before running after Ban to pester him for a treat. "She'll get no joy there." Zeldris was on the point of taking a seat at one of the tables when Estarossa strolled down the stairs, a languid smile curving over his face, Meliodas and Elizabeth following closely behind. Despite himself, Zeldris found himself bounding off the boar hat stool, eager for one of his eldest brother's morning hair ruffles. They were more than addictive. If only this stopped with Mel and Elizabeth it would be really nice, he thought as Meliodas wandered over to him and pulled him into a hug, Zeldris wrapping his arms round Meliodas's neck in return. "Do you have to all go, I mean all of you? Today?" Meliodas asked as he pulled away from Zeldris and turned to Elizabeth. "Surely someone can stay around to help me. Ban needs to go back to the Fairy King's forest to replenish the tree, and there's no way King will let that happen unless he's there from now on." "You know what happened last time," Elizabeth said soothingly. "And Elaine needs to go and see Gerhead, and if she's going I have to. She's not well at the moment. I think she's overexerting herself but she's determined to go. So why can't Diane stay?" "I don't understand," Meliodas began, stopping abruptly as Elizabeth giggled. "Well, if you must know, King proposed to her last night. He wants to introduce her to his clan, Elizabeth said, unable to contain her bubbling laughter. He went brick red and had a nosebleed. I had to fix him up. Meliodas chuckled at this, his shoulders dropping as his posture relaxed. You'll help me out, won't you, Zell? Meliodas said with a smile as he turned to his youngest brother. It's just me looking after the three of you tonight. I'll need someone responsible as my right-hand man. Zeldris's chest puffed up slightly with this, and he stood to attention as Meliodas ruffled his hair again, ignoring the crude faces Esterosa was pulling behind Elizabeth's back. The rest of the day passed smoothly enough. Zeldris kept trying to hear what Merlin and Esterosa were talking about, but each time he got close they ended their hushed, whispered chats. Something was in the offing, but he had no idea what. As three of them waved goodbye to the rest of the Sins as they left for the Fairy King's forest, Zeldris could not help but feel uneasy as his eldest brother's hand rested lightly on his head, the fingers weaving into his hair for a moment before they all headed inside. The sun was setting on the horizon, rosy fingers stretching over the land as day turned to night, lighting up the large barrel shape of the boar hat as the orb sunk below the skyline. We're not opening the bar today, so you guys can relax. Do whatever you want, just don't make a mess. You can't clean up yourselves and don't go outside. We're in a part of Britannia where there are wolves and I don't want you or them getting hurt, got it? Meliodas stood in front of the three children, his hands on his hips, the habitual, easygoing smile nowhere to be seen. He looked like he meant business. Esterosa and Merlin stood still, their faces blank and respectful as Meliodas headed back into the kitchen area to clean up the day's mess. Ban usually left everything spotless, but the party had set off in a hurry and there were bits and pieces to clean up, as well as the evening meal to prepare. As soon as Meliodas has gone, Merlin's face broke out in an evil grin as she pulled a vial from her purple smock. Here you go, just slip this in the food and the fun will begin. Merlin cackled as she handed the test tube to Esterosa. I'll distract him. Don't put the whole thing in, just a drop or two should do it. That will teach him to play favorites. No, Zeldris cried as he tried to grab the mixture from Esterosa, who merely held it as high as he could in the air out of Zeldris's reach. You can't, I won't let you. Spoil sport, Esterosa growled as he loomed over Zeldris, his shadow falling completely across the young demon's face. Zeldris was used to people being taller than him, of course, but it usually didn't bother him. He just pressed into their personal space and let his power do the talking. But now, unarmed and with a combat class close to zero, the experience was frightening and he shrank back from his brother as Esterosa laughed. It's pretty harmless, Zeldris, promise. It's just a little potion to make Meliodas remember himself so he doesn't favor you the whole time, Merlin wheedled, her voice soft and persuasive. It won't hurt him, and you don't want Esterosa to be treated unfairly, do you? We know it's not your fault, but that's what's happening at the moment. You need to let this go, for the sake of both your brothers. Hands clenched at his sides, Zeldris grit his teeth, not trusting Merlin's words but not seeing a way to break her argument. She was right. Ever since Meliodas had comforted him after his breakdown, the pair of them had shared an understanding about what they had both been through, the knowledge binding them together in a way blood on its own could never manage. He supposed that Esterosa had missed out in consequence, and that maybe Merlin was right, it was not entirely fair. He forgot in that moment that the apparent difference in treatment was at least partly due to the variation in behavior between himself and Esterosa. The latter had taken every opportunity to cause mischief while he had been as well behaved as he could. Before too long, Meliodas emerged from the kitchen carrying 4 bowls of soup, which Ban had left on the stove before heading off. It smelled delicious. As his brother set them down on the table, Zeldris watched Esterosa closely, noting the sly smirk on his round, childish face. He gasped audibly when Meliodas went back to the kitchen and Esterosa poured the entire contents of the vial into the soup sitting unguarded on the table. He grabbed Merlin's dress, but the witch ignored him, lost in contemplation as she looked out of the window. Zeldris's eyes followed hers and saw a shrunken Escanor approaching, his head bowed down as if in shame as he trudged slowly back to the boar hat. With a sigh of relief, Zeldris watched as Escanor entered the bar, pulling off his boots by the entrance. It would be good to have another responsible adult around, and at night this man was fairly sensible. On seeing Escanor, Meliodas, who had come back into the bar with some bread, gave a greeting before fetching him his own meal for the evening. Merlin immediately sidled up to the cowering man, working her way into his lap as he took his seat at one of the round, wooden tables. The man immediately beamed in delight, and let Merlin tell him all about her day, patting her head as she explained how she'd conducted an experiment that had gone well. Try as he might, Zeldris could not attract her attention. "All right everyone, dig in," Meliodas said cheerfully. Zeldris's eyes went wide, but before he could shout a warning Meliodas took a slurp of the soup. His eyes instantly widened, pupils and irises contracting dangerously as green burned to coal black. Estarossa laughed uncontrollably as Meliodas slipped to the floor, Zeldris running to his brother's side to stop his head from glancing painfully off the edge of the table. "What did you do?" Merlin asked with urgency as she looked at the demon writhing in agony, his body contorted as he twisted about on the stone floor of the bar. Foam flew from his mouth in white globules as Zeldris screamed, doing his best to steady Meliodas as the convulsions continued. His mind whirled wildly, trying to match his reactions and get rid of the growing terror simultaneously, and he found himself feeling nauseous again, but he forced the feeling down and held on with a gasp. Damn it, damn it, damn it. You gave him the lot, didn't you?" Merlin yelled above the ruckus, as Meliodas cried out, eyes open but unseeing as if he were trapped in a nightmare, as if he were reliving his worst memory and all they could do was watch helplessly. "I told you, only a few drops. Now he's in real trouble." As Estarossa opened his mouth in protest, Meliodas groaned loudly, his black eyes bulging slightly as his fists clenched by his sides. A snarl curled his lips, revealing unusually sharp teeth, fangs. Why did he have fangs? Greater demons weren't supposed to have fangs. And a look of such terror and hate that fear bubbled up sickeningly in Zeldris's stomach. "No, stop. Don't hurt her," he roared, voice rising to a horrible shriek as he tried to stand, his legs giving way from under him and sending him crashing to the floor in a seething huddle of magic and rage. 1,000 divine cuts, he growled as he held up an imaginary weapon in front of him and lunged at the wall, knocking a hole through the stone even in his addled state, dust flying all around as he prepared for another strike. "Kill me, I'm the one you want. Leave Elizabeth alone, this is bad," Merlin said, her girlish face uncommonly serious and pale with worry? Fear? Was she scared of? No, of course she was. You'd have to be insane not to be afraid of him, he thought, grasping at his brother's arm as Meliodas began hyperventilating and trying to hold him down, studiously ignoring his own rapid heartbeats. "He's reliving the battle with the two gods. He'll destroy the place unless I get him the antidote. So go get it then." Zeldris screamed, unintentionally switching to the ancient tongue as he rounded on Merlin, forgetting he was a child and a near powerless one at that. Merlin understood most languages, including this one, but Zeldris switched back to the common tongue on taking in her slightly fearful expression. "You have no idea what he's going through. Make it stop." "I'm going to have to make it," Merlin said grumpily as if this was nothing more than an inconvenience, as if his brother living through that again was just a minor annoyance. Idiot features here was only supposed to give him a little bit. "I had no idea we'd need the cure in a hurry." You'd better do it quickly, Miss Merlin," Escanor stuttered as Meliodas smashed through the bar. Blood pouring from his head where a splinter of wood had cut him badly, wide golden eyes tracking the Sin of Wrath's movements warily. Zeldris followed his gaze, resisting the urge to flinch as Meliodas let out a howl of rage and grief and slammed his knuckles into the wall, over and over, until they were split and bleeding, the bone nearly visible and the wooden walls were pounded to dust. "I'll stay with the captain." At this Merlin ran up the stairs to her lab, Estarossa following closely behind. Unsure of what to do, Zeldris remained where he was, trying to work out what on earth he could possibly do or say to help Meliodas calm down. Settling on tugging things away that he could hurt himself with, he dropped a clay canister by accident while trying to get to the knives and had nearly panicked himself upon seeing that Meliodas had grabbed a shard and squeezed it until his hand was bleeding deeply. Escanor looked equally perplexed, as he wandered around behind the raging mess of nerves, trying to coax him out of his nightmare. All of a sudden, there was an almighty crash and Merlin flew down the stairs, pulling Estarossa along by the ear. "I told you to be careful," she said crossly. "That was my only jar of bat's wings. Now I'll have to go and get some more." Boys. Utterly useless creatures. Zeldris would have protested, but he was preoccupied by A. his rampaging brother and B. The realization that Estarossa had done something, again, to mess things up. "Oh, no, what?" Escanor asked, his face turning pale. "Are you saying?" "Thanks to this fool," Merlin said as she gave Esterossa's ear a sharp tug. "I no longer have the 4 bats' wings I need for the antidote. I'm going to have to go catch some." "Incompetence," Zeldris snarled, beginning to feel himself in familiar territory. "Command, command, command. All of you are complete wastes of space. 4 bats' wings, is it? Fine." With that, Zeldris summoned his darkness, pushing past the blockage which had prevented his efforts until now. He had been training in secret, frustrated with the lack of progress, but his brother's need was all the impetus he required. With great difficulty, he pushed the soft, warm material over his back, forming 2 small wings at his shoulder blades. Estarossa gasped as the wings settled into position, unfurling into a perfect aerodynamic shape. "How come you can do that? I've been trying for weeks," Estarossa complained as he started enviously at his younger brother. "It's not fair. I'm older than you. It's perfectly fair. While you've been messing about with Merlin, planning this crap, I've been practicing. This is why I will always beat you at everything. Even if you're more accomplished, you have no application," Zeldris said haughtily. This was more like it. He was a demon prince, leader of the 10 Commandments, born to rule. And he would fix this mess and save Meliodas from Merlin's nightmare. With a few beats of his wings, unsteady at first then increasingly confident, Zeldris rose into the air and flew from the boarhead. How hard could it be to catch 4 flying rats? Pretty hard, as he soon discovered. There were a number of the creatures out hunting for insects, but they were fast, well prepared and not easy to grab in midair, particularly when his wings refused to behave themselves and kept sending him in unintended directions. It took a lot practice, but eventually Zeldris caught a couple of specimens, wrapping tendrils of darkness around their mouths to prevent them from nipping his fingers as he clutched at their warm, furry bodies. They felt so soft, and Zeldris felt a momentary flash of guilt as he sped them back to the boarhead. It did not seem a fair way for their lives to end, but if it meant saving his brother, he'd kill 1,000 of the things. In the bar, things had gone from bad to worse. Meliodas was in an extremely dangerous condition, and Zeldris felt bile rise in his throat when he saw that his beloved brother had torn out chunks of his own hair, and was eating the skin which clung to the roots. He had scratched his arms raw, blood trailing down his limbs as he thrashed on the floor, preventing anyone from coming close enough to restrain him. The panic in the air was palpable. As soon as Zeldris landed, Merlin grabbed the bats and headed upstairs, glowering at Estarossa when he tried to go after her. The silver-haired boy was in tears, visibly trembling as he looked at the carnage of his surroundings. Zeldris felt a slight stab of pity, before remembering whose fault this was in the first place, at which point the sympathy died in his. He would make Estarossa pay later. No more than a minute or 2 passed before Merlin ran down the stairs, another vial in hand, this one glowing bright green. The liquid in the test tube cast an eerie glow over the room, picking out the damage caused in sharp relief. With absolutely no fear on her features, Merlin walked over to Meliodas and thrust the test tube between his teeth, forcing him to gulp down the contents. Tense seconds passed, Zeldris staring in desperation until Meliodas collapsed on the floor, his marks shrinking to skin and his limbs falling like wood around him. He was safe. Zeldris wanted to scream at Merlin, but his throat was too tight, tears of relief and anger prickling the back of his eyes. "That is quite enough of that," a cold voice sounded, and Zeldris looked round, surprised and startled to see that the words had come from Escanor of all people. "Merlin, I am extremely disappointed in you, and you Estarossa. You will clean this place up immediately while I get the captain upstairs. I want this place looking exactly like it was before Elizabeth gets home. If it is still a mess in the morning, I will let my day self deal with you. Is that understood?" Merlin and Estarossa went pale, and immediately started to clean up the boarhead, Merlin's magic making short work of the more extensive damage. In response to a nod from Escanor, Zeldris hurried over to his brother, and tried to help the man pick Meliodas up off the ground. But Escanor was too weak. Try as he might, he did not have the strength. With a guilty look, Escanor went off to get a pillow and blankets while Zeldris watched as his brother's chest, drenched in sweat, rose and fell in what looked to be a mercifully peaceful sleep. He had no intention of leaving Meliodas's side until Elizabeth was back and could heal him. Elizabeth silently vowed never to leave Meliodas alone with Merlin or Estarossa ever again. She wasn't sure that she even trusted them enough to leave Zeldris alone with them, for that matter she definitely didn't. Try though she might to deny it to herself, the youngest of the three great evil stars had become dear to her in a way that even she wasn't sure how to handle. For the first time, she understood how her father felt when she'd gone out climbing trees and trying to fight monsters with borrowed kitchen knives, completely, utterly terrified for this small creature that was worth more than almost anything in the world. The trip to the forest had gone well. The fairies had welcomed her as a friend of their kings and the giant queens. Elaine had been proclaimed as healthy, except Elizabeth felt that was mainly to calm Ban's rapidly fraying nerves. She'd never seen the man so on edge, but she was still fragile physically and had been asked to stay in the forest as the raw vitality of it would do her good. She'd accepted the offer and had simultaneously managed to get Ban to return to the Boar Hat. Diane had been welcomed with open arms and a group of fairies had immediately suggested crowning her the Fairy Queen as well as ruler of the giant clan, which, of course, had made King blush like mad and Diane laugh but politely turned down the crown. "I'm just happy to be with Harlequin," she'd chirped, before kissing the sputtering sin of sloth on the cheek. It had been warm and bright and, quite frankly, beautiful. And then she'd returned to find that everything had gone to hell in her absence. Zeldris was sitting next to an unconscious, bloody Meliodas on the floor of the bar, jaw set, teeth clenched and shoulders shaking. He'd told her, his voice perfectly calm, his face a practiced mask of blank disinterest, what Merlin and Estarossa had done, what Meliodas had done to himself, how he'd had to take charge in order to keep everyone together. His voice had wavered, catching a bit when he told her how Meliodas had scratched his arms raw and split his knuckles until the bone was visible through clotted scarlet. Elizabeth only noticed the scratches on Zeldris's own hands and arms after he finished speaking, after his breathing grew shallower with the effort of trying not to cry, the blood trickling down his cheek as if someone had grazed it, and fury rose up in her, at Merlin for having the idea, at Estarossa for executing it, at Escanor for not doing enough to protect her boys, at herself for not being there to keep them safe. My boys. The words felt right, somehow. Meliodas's heart belonged to her and hers to him, and Zeldris had somehow captured her soul in an entirely different manner. They were hers to protect, to keep safe and hold. And she hadn't been there. She forced back the tears that threatened now, taking a deep breath as she twined her fingers around Meliodas's limp ones, dried blood scraping under her fingers. Zeldris's breathing, harsh and shallow and rapid, filled her ears, the kind of fear that only erupted after being pushed down and painted over and tied in shadow radiating off of him. Panic. Raw, distinct panic that this child had hidden because he'd had someone to protect. She could feel his heartbeats echoing in her ears, a wild thumping laid over Meliodas's steady 7 pulses. "Come here," she murmured, wrapping an arm around his shoulders and pulling him into her side. He buried his face in her shoulder, the low, keening sound of barely muffled sobs ringing in her ears as she wrapped pure healing magic around them, letting her eyes drift closed. She rested her chin on his head and opened her eyes, staring blankly at the wall as she held them together. Protect, her instincts seemed to whisper. Protect, 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 protect. And on the whispers went, until the words rose to a roar and Zeldris's sobs quieted. Elizabeth lifted a hand and ran her fingers gently through his hair, before rising to her feet, reluctantly releasing Meliodas's hand. Dried, rust-brown blood had flaked off his arms and onto her hands, but she ignored it. It would wash off, always did. The stain of what Merlin and Estarossa had done would be far harder to remove. Small fingers tightened around her other hand, dark eyes hollow with exhaustion and wet with tears staring up at her as if she might hold some hidden key to everything. "I wish I did," she thought helplessly. "Gods, if only I did." She lifted Zeldris in her arms and started towards the stairs, mind fixed on that one sanctuary, on the safety of the room she shared with Meliodas. "No," Zeldris's words snapped her out of the dulled trance, and she cast him a worried look as he reached over her shoulder with a shuddering gasp. "No, don't want to leave him, please, Elizabeth. I'll bring him up in a moment," she assured him softly, halting on the first step. "You both need to rest." His red-rimmed eyes widened, a protest rising on his lips. "But, Zeldris." She started up the stairs again, ignoring the protests of her travel-weary muscles as she reached the top, tightening her grip slightly as she passed Merlin's door. "I'll deal with her later. You did an amazing thing today, stepped up when no one else did. And I know," she went on, grief thundering in her heart at the thought, "that you're used to that, but you're also 5 years old now. Some things are too much, and forcing yourself to go on after what you've done is one of those things." She fumbled for the doorknob as she reached the familiar door, the small sign with her name and Meliodas's on it, her looping script next to his untidy scrawl. "It's nearly midnight, too. You're not suited to staying awake for long periods of time like this, not in this state." Elizabeth managed to twist it open, giving a mental cry of victory as she slipped into the comforting, familiar darkness. She set him down on the bed carefully, ruffling his hair gently. "Get some rest," she instructed. "Meliodas and I will be up in a bit." He twined his fingers together in his lap, ducking his head. "Promise?" That one word, so hesitant and hopeful and yet hurt, broke her heart. "Promise," she whispered, before turning, closing the door gently behind her. She leaned against the wall and sighed, hitting the back of her head against it. "Fuck." Her gaze drifted to Merlin's door and she gritted her teeth. "I may actually kill her." She could feel the temptation, swirling within her with her deadliest magic. An orb of light danced around her fingers, and she knew it contained enough power to destroy the lab Merlin loved so much. "But I'm not that person." Elizabeth let the light evaporate, let it vanish into the air with another sigh. "And I won't do that to a comrade, no matter how ill-advised her decisions." She shook her head before stalking back down the hall, hurrying down the steps. The others would be returning soon. She'd left early when it had become apparent that Elaine wasn't returning to the Boarhat for a while, but they'd promised to be right behind her, and they'd never broken a promise to her yet. And she, for Meliodas's sake, for Zeldris's, and even the two idiots who'd caused all this, wasn't going to let them come home to a world in shatters. Her boots, she'd forgotten to take them off, to exchange them for the soft slippers she normally wore around the Boarhat. She was still dressed for travel and her muscles were taut with that strange anticipation of adventure clacked on the wood as she descended, the sound resounding off the battered walls of the place that had become her home. Green eyes flashed in the darkness, bloodshot and shadowed. "Meliodas," she breathed, and stepped closer. "You're alive." His voice was choked, his eyes glittering with unshed tears. "You're alive." "I'm alive," she agreed quietly, dropping to her knees in front of him. His eyes were wild, almost feral in his panic, and Elizabeth felt pain twist her insides as she grabbed his hand, bringing it over her heart. She willed him to feel the steady beat, to realize that he was here with her and not in the past, holding a long-dead goddess whose memories she shared. "I'm here. I will always be here, even when I'm nothing but a whisper on the wind. For you, I will be eternal." "Elizabeth," he gasped, and then she was being pulled into a tight hug, his arms trembling as shadows danced nervously around them, subconsciously called upon by Meliodas's power. Lord of Darkness indeed, she thought to herself. Did I or they? As always, she knew what he was talking about, who he was talking about. "They're safe," she murmured. "Zeldris is a little shaken, but I took care of his wounds. There weren't many, just some scrapes and bruises." She immediately cursed herself. Why would she say that, knowing what the two of them had suffered at their father's hands? There was no way that Meliodas wouldn't blame himself. Sure enough, his breath hitched in his lungs and Elizabeth closed her eyes, resting her hand over where his heart would be if he were human. "Esterosa is fine," she rushed on, feeling a prick of guilt for not actually checking to see if he was okay and vowing to do so later. "Merlin is too." There was a shaky exhale, and he stood. She rose as well, spinning light in her hand to illuminate the shadowy room, unintentionally casting his battered face in sharp relief. Elizabeth winced, sending the light up into the lanterns that normally lit the bar as Meliodas stretched his arms, clearly trying to disguise the way they trembled. "Thank the gods. I'll be up after I clean." "Oh, hell no." Elizabeth wasn't really sure why the words had enraged her so, but she drew herself up to her full height, blue eyes sharp and cutting as steel. "They might be fine, but you aren't. We can fix the bar up properly in the morning when the others get home. You stubborn fool, are going to get some sleep." He blinked at her, wide green eyes gleaming with shock. But he sounds exactly like Zeldris, she thought, and the realization gave her some much-needed amusement. "I will knock you out and carry you up there myself, so help me," she declared, planting her hands on her hips. There was a tiny huff of laughter, one that was choked down as soon as it was formed. "I'd like to see you try," he retorted, and she grinned because this was new. They'd never been able to bicker and compete before, except in previous lives, because she hadn't learned to fight until recently and he'd been too worried about triggering the curse to try. It was fun, mocking him and knowing that he wouldn't take it seriously, that he'd retort right back and that they could because they no longer had to hide everything from one another. "Need I remind you of a certain slap?" His grin was genuine, this time shaky, but genuine. "Alright, I'm going, geez. Anything but the slap." Elizabeth laughed, relieved, before herding him up the stairs. He shook his head at her, but went willingly, thank the gods. She wasn't sure how she'd handle it if he went catatonic, opening the door to their room. "Oh," he whispered as she slipped in after them, shooting her a worried glance. "Looks like he's seen Zeldris." She peered over his shoulder and stifled a squeal. The youngest prince's tiny body was curled around a pillow, one small hand grasping nothing in particular, knuckles just barely grazing the headboard. "That kind of cuteness should be illegal. Do you think? I trust you, Meliodas," she declared sternly, giving him a gentle push towards the bed. He stumbled forwards with a yelp, clearly caught off guard, and landed next to his youngest brother. "And he trusts you?" Elizabeth pulled off her boots, sighing with relief as she sat down on the other side of the bed and slung her coat over the peg on the wall, stretching. It was a lucky thing that the tunic and leggings she'd worn were comfortable, because she was exhausted and had absolutely zero intention of changing. "Sleep," she breathed, seeing wide green eyes peering at her worriedly. "Sleep. Breathe. Remember where you are, who we are." She reached over Zeldris, interlocking his fingers with hers. "I love you." Green eyes softened, crinkling in a smile that she couldn't see but knew was there all the same. "I love you too." Elizabeth waited until his eyes drifted closed, until his breathing slowed, before exhaling softly and letting her own shut too. Things can only get better. A week passed, and as for things getting better, well. Elizabeth was an optimist at heart, but even she was starting to worry. Okay, scratch that. She was extremely concerned about the increasingly bizarre dynamic between Meliodas and the children, two of whom were beginning to act more like their physical ages than she expected. Despite retaining all their memories and the core of their personalities, Zeldris and Esterosa seemed to be mentally regressing at least partly to match their current ages. Though she really only had one person to test the theory, she was starting to sound like Merlin. This was definitely bad, against. They rarely saw Esterosa anymore, the middle brother locking himself in his room and rarely coming out for anything, even food. Whenever he did, he seemed exhausted, with shadowed, red-rimmed eyes and an appetite far too small to be healthy, and he distinctly avoided speaking with anyone. Meliodas kept trying to bridge the growing gap between them, but any attempt to do so resulted in Esterosa retreating even further. Meanwhile, Zeldris was oddly jumpy and clingier than normal, and his absolute hatred for Merlin was palpable, seen in the smoldering black-eyed glares that tracked her every movement, in the wisps of uncontrolled darkness that wrapped protectively around whoever he was with at the moment. Merlin, of course, didn't care at all, didn't seem to be bothered by the events or even contrite. She'd given a blasé apology before going right back to causing mischief, albeit at a slightly less extreme level, though that was mainly because no one would partake in pranks with her anymore. Everyone else seemed to be tiptoeing around this weird situation, and even Elizabeth wasn't sure how to patch this, whatever it was, back together. A family? She knew Meliodas considered the Sins his family and she had come to do the same, but with the addition of his brothers, everything had seemed sort of off-kilter and weird. And this happens right as everyone's starting to pull together, she thought crossly, pouring herself a mug of coffee and staring out at the dawn. She'd woken early that morning, unable to sleep from trying to puzzle out the conundrum that was their current situation. The bar was closed for today, so she had no way to take her mind off of things, and Ban had, well, banned her from the kitchen after she and Meliodas had set it on fire trying to boil water. "I think that was quite an improvement for us," she muttered to herself. "Last time we almost flooded the place. A little bit of fire builds character, that's what I say." She downed the coffee, feeling a bit better as she swallowed the scalding liquid. The scorch marks even washed out, she went on, eyeing the stove wistfully. "So no harm done." She drummed her fingers on the table absently, before snorting with derision, "And I'm talking to myself now." "Fantastic." She eyed the stove for a moment before sighing. I'm a fucking princess, she declared, lifting her chin and grinning ruefully at the taste of the curse on her tongue. It wasn't long ago that she'd never dreamed of swearing, but, well, spending several months, years now, she could scarcely believe it. Around mouths like Meliodas's and bands could rub off on a girl. Your orders have been overridden, sin of greed. I'm making. She frowned, stalking over to the pantry and opening it. Not much left. Potatoes, she decided aloud, pulling a few free of the bag on the floor. Mashed potatoes. Easy and delicious. G-morning, a sleepy voice mumbled, and she felt a soft smile overtake her face as a small body pressed against her side. She knelt, giving Zeldris a quick hug before eyeing the potatoes thoughtfully. He stood on his toes, blinking those dark eyes at the root vegetables as though they held the secrets of the universe. I thought Ban said you couldn't cook. I can cook, Elizabeth said crossly. Just not well. Zeldris giggled at that, before clapping his hand over his mouth, eyes widening. She glanced at him, smiling at the surprise on his face. I think that's the first time he's laughed like that in a while. Definitely the first time I've heard it. But I guess sneaking into the kitchen behind his back isn't a good idea, she went on. So let's keep it a secret between us, Don't tell him or King, because King's awful at keeping other people's secrets. I won't, he said loyally, and she ruffled his hair with a small smile, scooping up the potatoes and returning them before leading him out of the kitchen. Merlin was already waiting there, golden eyes glittering. Instantly Zeldris's eyes turned as hard and cold as chips of ice, teeth bared as a growl, barely human, barely even demonic, rolled forth from his throat. This can only end badly, Elizabeth realized, and she stepped between them swiftly. Zeldris, why don't you play outside for a bit? I'll see if Diane will go exploring with you, she suggested. Maybe you'll find another black hound for Oslo to play with? The youngest demon prince gave her a look that said he knew precisely what she was doing. It had gotten to the point where she sometimes forgot that he was only 5 in the physical sense, but he huffed anyway and complied, pulling the stick that served as a sword from the umbrella stand and hurrying out the door. To his credit, he didn't slam it on his way out, though it was closed with worrying force. Elizabeth sighed, pushing her bangs out of her eyes more from habit than anything. They'd grown back after the war. But even then she hadn't been able to stop herself from running her fingers through the shorn locks. Merlin, what are you doing here? You normally don't come downstairs until 9 o'clock at least. It's barely, she glanced at the clock on the wall, 7:15. Merlin shrugged, sore throat, decided to make some tea. Don't worry, though Ban said he'd watch to make sure I don't burn anything. Elizabeth narrowed her eyes. She knew the gleam in that golden gaze all too well. That was the look she got before Merlin did something reckless, stupid, experimental, or all three. But she couldn't see a lie anywhere in there, and she had been coughing recently. Be careful, she warned, and they both knew she was referring to more than the hot water. Trust me. Merlin's eyes glowed, luminous with mischief and glee. I know what I'm doing. And that was probably the least trustworthy thing she'd ever heard the sin of gluttony say. But she fixed her in a knife-sharp stare before spinning on her heel and following Zeldris outside. He had a tendency to wander, and Elizabeth didn't need a heart attack right now, especially not one from losing a demon prince who was generally despised by the masses. Things ran smoothly onwards for about an hour more, and Elizabeth was glad for the chance to pretend at normalcy, following Zeldris and Oslo as they explored the nearby woods. Oslo hadn't liked the newcomers at all at first, but after Elaine and King had shown a modicum of trust towards the former commandments, he'd followed suit. He'd even taken a shine to Zeldris, and now accompanied him whenever he went exploring. Elizabeth followed them now, eventually arming herself with a stick and acting as a dastardly villain that he and the Black Hound vanquished together, the two of them pretending to fight over a particularly picturesque stream with flowers all around it until they were both giggling and stumbling into the water over and over. She picked herself up after one such fall with a laugh, figuring she'd tell Meliodas about it, and maybe they could find a way to drag Esterosa out of his room long enough for a picnic. Or maybe he'd go with King and Diane instead of Meliodas. After all, he was chiefly avoiding herself and the sin of wrath. She shook off the thought, raising the branch with a yell. Aha, I have you now, hero. Get her, Oslo. Elizabeth let out a mock wail as the Black Hound tackled her surprisingly carefully to the ground, Zeldris tapping her throat gently with the stick. I win, he crowed, bouncing on his toes gleefully. I would totally have beaten you in the war, too, if we'd ever gone head to head. I doubt it, she thought, her competitive spirit stirring, but she beat it down and grinned at him. Perhaps. It was good to see him like this, bright and beaming and genuinely happy, no longer subdued by habit or cloaked in rage, and it was probably good for him, too. Should we? A shrill scream, a howl, echoed through the forest and she stiffened, eyes widening as magic sparked around her fingers instinctively. Zeldris had flinched at the noise, eyes growing wide with fear that she knew he'd never admit to. The boar hat, she realized, fingers curling into fists. It's coming from the boar hat. Stay close me, she called over her shoulder. Oslo, guard him. A bark of affirmation came from the beast-like fairy, and she started stalking back towards the boar hat. Luckily, they hadn't wandered far, more like in a circle, she thought absently from home, the familiar tankard-shaped tavern coming into view as she burst free of the undergrowth. She skidded to a halt as she reached the door, throwing it open and darting in. And she froze. Meliodas spun on his heel, eyes wide and face pale with horror. In his arms he held a child, a toddler, no more than 3, with familiar red eyes and spiky white-blue hair. Merlin was perched on the banister, eyes glittering with a savage glee, and Esterosa was pressed against the wall, black eyes huge with not fear, but something else, something she couldn't place. A broken cup leaked tea onto the ground, and the toddler's face was wet with tears. A hand clamped over his mouth as if to stifle another wail. Merlin, Elizabeth hissed, her gaze drifting to the hovering sin of gluttony. Meliodas nodded, still holding the toddler ban as though he were made of glass. Merlin, he agreed. The magic of de-aging someone was a sight to behold. Having happened to him in his sleep, Esterosa had no idea how the transformation actually worked. What changed first and how it felt. He knew it could not have been particularly painful, otherwise he would have woken up, but apart from that he was clueless. To see Ban, a man even taller than himself when at his physical peak, shrink in all directions, his bored, haggard face melting into that of a cute little boy as he was surrounded by a soft golden light, was nothing short of a miracle. For several seconds, Esterosa stared at the tiny human who was barely more than a toddler, excitement and resentment running through his veins, that is, before Ban howled in anguish and jumped unceremoniously into Meliodas's arms. No doubt I'll get the blame for all this, as usual, even though it's all Merlin's fault, the young demon thought sulkily. He should have stayed in his room like always, brooding over the injustice of Elizabeth and Meliodas's anger towards him. How was he to know that overdoing the dose of whatever that stuff was that Merlin had made would make his brother go that crazy? He was not stupid. Despite whatever Zeldris thought he had a perfect understanding of what it meant to be face to face with their father's disapproval, he just did his best not to show it. Easier to pretend those encounters had never happened than confront them head on. That didn't mean he had somehow miraculously escaped that particular horror for all of his 380 years. However angry he was with this ridiculous situation, why had he been chucked out of the demon realm anyway? He could understand the new queen not wanting Zeldris around, but for fuck's sake she owed him. Living with the sins was a nightmare. He would never want either of his brothers to relive that particular horror. Ban was crying, loudly. The sound ripped through the boar hat like a banshee's wail, tearing at his ears. He couldn't stand crying, never had been able to stomach it. Merlin of course was cackling with glee, her golden eyes sparkling with mirth. Had she not learned her lesson by now? He supposed that maybe this was partly his fault. By refusing to play with her he had forced her to look for another companion, though getting rid of the bar's only decent cook was possibly the most selfish thing the witch had ever done. When Elizabeth rushed in, her blue and orange eyes piercing into him as if searching his very soul, Esterosa felt even more cross than he had done for the past week. He could see the initial assumption of his guilt in Elizabeth's features, her lips pursed and fingers glowing white as she summoned her powers. It was only on seeing Merlin's ever-cheeky expression that Elizabeth switched her gaze to the witch, and Esterosa could feel himself breathe once more, the blood pounding in his temple as his heart lurched into action. Maybe she'll get punished on her own this time. Esterosa felt his heart soar as Elizabeth rounded on Merlin, clearly incorrectly pinning the blame completely on her for once. Go to your room, now. Elizabeth thundered, her eyes glowing with the silver symbol of her clan. I will come and see you later. Until then, you need to have a good, hard think about what you've done. Merlin pouted, but obeyed, trudging up the stairs of the boarhat, tromping her feet as she went. No punishment at all, she'll only get lost in another experiment. Ban? Elizabeth said softly as she sidled up to the small child who was still clinging to Meliodas's baggy shirt with both fists. It's all right, we'll find a way out of this. Elizabeth, I couldn't wait anymore, it started to rain. What? As Zeldris and Oslo ran into the bar, both shaking off droplets of water onto the cobbled, stone floor, Zeldris's black eyes went wide as he stared hard at Ban. Esterosa could see the emotions working on Zeldris's face. He's completely forgotten how to control himself since becoming a child, and sniggered when it appeared that jealousy was about to win the day. Now you'll have to share your beloved Meliodas, you suck up, Esterosa thought without any hint of irony, completely forgetting the way he had followed his elder brother around like a sheep the first time around. It was with great astonishment that he saw the envy vanish from Zeldris's features to be replaced with something wholly familiar and completely unexpected. You want to play with my toys? Zeldris asked kindly as he walked closer to Ban. Come on, I'll show you. You'll like them. Ban stared at the demon for several seconds, lips quivering, wiping his dripping nose on the back of his hand, before jumping down from Meliodas's arms. Zeldris held out his hand, and Esterosa was more than a little surprised to see the tiny boy take it willingly before he let himself be led up the stairs of the boarhat, Zeldris coaxing him as they went. He's looking out for him. In what way is that fair? Who does that human think he is? Stay away from my stuff, okay? Esterosa yelled as the two children disappeared from view. He felt annoyed and dejected, as if he had somehow failed at something but did not quite know what. The more he thought about it, the more upset he became. Why did he always let Zeldris take the initiative? His younger brother was not much more than a fledgling, for goodness sake. He was the elder, he should be in charge. What are we going to do, Meliodas? We can't keep this up. What if Merlin turns us into kids next? Elizabeth asked fretfully, and Esterosa seethed. She had obviously completely forgotten he was there. I don't know. Meliodas held his head in his hands, his stubby fingers running through the messy locks. This is a nightmare. It was bad enough before, but now. Bad enough before, huh? Well, I didn't want to be here either, you shit. None of this is fair. With a huff of disgust, Esterosa ran outside into the rain, not caring at all that the freezing cold droplets found their way under the collar of his jacket or that the wind whipped his already messy hair into a tangled mat. He needed to get away from all this. Perhaps if he begged the queen for forgiveness. He could not stay here anymore with two brothers he barely recognized and a bunch of irritating do-gooders, that was for sure. It was just so unnatural. What are you doing? Came a flat voice on the wind, and Esterosa whipped round, trying to locate the source of the sound. He scanned the horizon, but no, there was nothing. The rain was pelting down in steady hard drops. Even the hardy folk of Britannia, used to the almost perpetually inclement weather of the verdant but soggy land, were giving this particular storm a miss. Even the animals had taken shelter. There was no living thing to be seen for miles around. Up here, the voice called again, and Esterosa gazed into the trees, finally catching a flash of pink among the leaves. His curiosity piqued. He climbed the tree next to the boarhat, making easy work of the wide, tall oak which must be decades old. In just a few moments, he was face to face with the disembodied voice, and was surprised to see it was none other than his comrade of old, Gother's doll. I was wondering when you would come to me. You have been slower than I expected, Gowther said carefully, his voice and expression as usual showing absolutely no emotion. You have been finding it difficult to be here. You should have asked for my help sooner. What can you do, traitor? Esterosa spat, forgetting that he was only 8 years old and that the war was finally over. He had missed the doll, more than he would ever care to admit, and the addition of Frodrin to the ranks of the commandments, as if in compensation, had irked him considerably. I know you are not finding living here easy, Gowther explained, his amber eyes examining Esterosa minutely. That is why you are moping and misbehaving. I can understand your predicament. You are angry with Zeldris for the act which got the two of you banished. You are livid with Meliodas and Elizabeth for offering a home you do not want but know that you need, and you are furious with yourself for not being able to make friends with the others, even though deep down that is what you really want. Esterosa felt his legs give way, and he sat down hard on the branch of the tree, scraping the palms of his hands on the rough bark. The pain was almost welcome. Anything to distract himself from the truth of Gother's words. So where have you been then? Estarossa said sulkily, I haven't seen you since we got here. Why haven't you? I wanted you to make the transition on your own, just as Zeldris has done. At this, Gowther gestured to the window of the adjacent boarhat which gave a view into Zeldris's room. Estarossa felt a growl of irritation rise in his throat as he saw his brother making what appeared to be a paper aeroplane for the younger boy, Ban jumping up and down in excitement and clapping his hands in delight. The expression of joy on his brother's face, his pure enjoyment at having some responsibility even if just over a tiny human child, was more than Estarossa could take. But you evidently need some help, Gowther continued. That is why I have come out of the attic. It is time to put an end to this nonsense. Estarossa steeled himself to ask the question no one else would be able to answer. Now the doll had his memories back, he would have an insight into the demon realm not even Meliodas could call on. Gowther, do you think, will Derriere? No, you have burned your bridges with the queen. She will never forgive you, the doll replied. This is the penalty you face for being an ass. But I didn't do anything, Estarossa whined, clenching his hands into fists. It was all Zeldris's fault. He may have been the one who committed the act of treason, but the queen is not angry with you over that, Gowther intoned. It was your constant teasing of her and Monspeed when you were in the demon realm which has sealed your fate. You never made any effort to make friends with the others, and were quite happy to kill your comrades to suit your own purposes. You should have known that once your father was gone your welcome there would be limited with the way you have behaved. Estarossa was silent, reflecting on the truth of Gowther's words. The doll was right he supposed. He had indeed tried to kill Derriere and Monspeed to retrieve their decrees. Well, how was he supposed to know that just asking for them would be enough? He still could not believe the pair had just handed their power over to Zeldris when he had made the request, nor that the information that Meliodas was after the decrees was what had swayed the two warriors. None of it made any sense. You are making the same mistakes here, Gowther added, his eyes fixed on Estarossa. The Sins are good people. You are throwing away your one chance at happiness by making yourself disagreeable. It's not me, it's Merlin, Estarossa protested. All this has been her idea. It's not, you have to stop focusing on what is and what is not fair, Gowther said sternly. And you know well it is not all Merlin's doing. You have been plotting mischief with her for weeks. I agree these latest pranks have been of her making only, but you set the tone. You let your anger and resentment mar your chances of fitting in with the others. Come on, it is time I put a stop to this, Gowther said in response to Esterossa's silence. Follow me. At this Gowther picked up the book which had lain on the branch next to him and started to climb up the tree, the branches barely bending under the pressure from his lithe frame. Estarossa followed him easily, for once thankful of his return to the small stature he had so despised as he and Gowther made their way up the tree. At the very topmost point, a slender branch, barely more than a twig, snaked its way to the top of the barrel-shaped bar. Gowther walked along it expertly, like a master tightrope walker, Estarossa clumsily following behind. Once atop of the bar, Gowther propelled himself through a window, the demon climbing into the opening more carefully behind him. The room Estarossa found himself in was absolutely stuffed full of books. Tomes lined all of the walls as well as forming piles on the table and floor. The spines were worn, showing that they had been read many times. The whole place smelled slightly musty, like dust and parchment. It was a bit like the library in his father's castle back home, and for the first time since setting foot in the boar hat Estarossa felt somewhat comfortable. It is time Merlin put this mess right, Gowther said, his amber eyes gleaming. My magic is strong, but it is not enough to undo her spells. I think I have a way to persuade her, however. At this, Gowther headed out of the door and down the stairs towards Merlin's lab, Estarossa eagerly following behind. Now she'll finally get published, and I'll get to see it. On reaching the door to the lab, Gowther pushed the door open without knocking. The sight of the many jars of ingredients, the test tubes sitting in racks and the acrid smell emanating from the odd bubbling mixture in the cauldron which sat atop a crackling green fire was enough to make Esterossa's hearts race with stress. The lab looked just like it had that night when he had inadvertently smashed that jar of bat's wings, causing Merlin to pull him down the stairs painfully by the ear. Gowther stepped confidently into the room as Estarossa shrank back into the shadows. The doll was an incredible foe, but Merlin was an extremely dangerous opponent. Merlin, you will change, Ban, Zeldris and Esterosa back into adults, the doll intoned, his eyes obscured by his glasses which shone green in the light of the fire. Gother's youthful face gave no sign of fear even though Esterosa felt himself quaking. "Shan't," Merlin giggled as she stepped into the light of the fire, her long, glossy black hair also glowing in the emerald light. She had never looked more like a witch. "You stay out of this, Gowther, or you'll be sorry. Then you leave me no choice." "Jack," Gowther cried. The room suddenly dulled, the bright verdant fire now burning with a muddy light as the silhouette of the doll stood proud in the relative dark. "You no longer have control of your own body. I will make you use absolute cancel and undo this wrong." "I don't think so," Merlin's voice floated through the gloom, and as the fire burned more brightly Esterosa could make out the shape of a bright pink cube. She protected herself. Even Gowther could not attack her, the thought, in awe in spite of himself. "Now that is impressive. Now it's my turn." Merlin giggled and Esterosa flinched as a soft golden light surrounded the doll, engulfing his whole form which shimmered and then, suddenly, began to shrink. Gother's arms were pulled into his body, his torso sinking to the floor as his legs slowly shortened, his head growing smaller, and Merlin cackled with laughter as the glasses fell from his face. "What the hell is going on?" yelled a familiar voice as Meliodas and Elizabeth ran into the lab. Esterosa peeked up into his brother's face and he was shocked to see his elder sibling, the leader he had always admired, the fearsome weapon, looking as if he were close to collapsing, and Elizabeth did not look much better. Both of them stared in horror at the small, little Gowther, barely more than 3 feet high, as he picked up his now oversized glasses from the wooden floor. "Merlin!" Meliodas yelled, his forehead pulsing black as he rounded on the small girl, who suddenly looked pretty scared. "I have had enough. We have been friends for millennia, and despite all of this I care about you, but I swear if you do not make this right you will leave the boarhead today, and I will tell Arthur what you have done, so don't expect to go crying to him. You have gone too far this time." At this, Merlin burst into tears and Esterosa found himself flinching again. How many more people were going to cry today, for fuck's sake? He was on the point of complaining when Elizabeth rushed to the girl, scooping her up in her arms and cooing softly to her, Merlin's sobs quieting as she did so. "Shush, it's all right," Elizabeth said comfortingly, her back to Meliodas as she crouched on the floor holding the girl in her arms. "He doesn't mean it. We are both disappointed with your behavior, but you always have a home here. We love you." Merlin took a few audible gulps, squeezing the goddess tight, her tiny hands pulling at her comforter's clothes. "You promise?" she squeaked out, burying her face into Elizabeth's shoulder. "I promise," Elizabeth murmured, holding Merlin even closer to her. She completely missed the look of wicked triumph which the girl shot over her shoulder towards Meliodas, the satisfaction in her face more than palpable. Esterosa looked up at his brother, who had his hand on Gother's head, and was not at all surprised to see that Meliodas's left eye was twitching uncontrollably as a vein pulsed angrily in his neck. Merlin may be powerful, but she was playing a dangerous game. Shall I take Gowther downstairs to play with Zeldris and Ban?" the small demon asked tentatively. "I think we can keep them amused until lunch." Esterosa felt his heart soar as Meliodas looked at him gratefully, the tension in his brother's features softening appreciably as he did so. "Yes, please. You are very kind." "Thank you, Esterosa," Meliodas said with relief, and Esterosa felt his chest puff up with pride as his brother ruffled his hair as he went out of the door. To say that things got better post Merlin's sort of rampage would be a definite overstatement, but at least things had settled into some semblance of normalcy. Meliodas was still furious with Merlin, but it didn't seem like anyone hated each other anymore, well, no more than usual. In short, things were back to normal-ish. Elizabeth peered over the edge of the balcony as Hawk Mama thudded across the plains. She'd instructed the kids, especially Ban, who was exceedingly tiny and thus very breakable. She'd had nightmares involving them falling off of the tavern while Hawk Mama was still moving, often involving broken legs and ribs and abandonment, to stay inside, had warned Merlin that Meliodas would be the one to deal with her if she tried anything, and had headed up to the rooftop for a breath of fresh air. Pale clouds peppered the horizon, and the muscles on her back twinged wistfully. I almost wish the change had come with wings. What would it be like, she wondered, to have that sort of absolute freedom? To hold flight in the palm of your hand. Magical, probably. Gah, she muttered, pushing herself backwards and turning back towards the stairs. This is what comes of a lack of sleep, Elizabeth. Get it together and look after them. She headed down the stairs, mentally mapping out the day. There had to be ways to keep them busy. Zeldris was generally up for anything, surprisingly eager to experience a normal human childhood, despite his protests. Esterosa was a different story, though he'd been more agreeable lately. Ban was caught trying to sneak into the kitchen multiple times. Poor Meliodas had had a heart attack the first time. But other than that, he seemed satisfied with nearly any activity. It was hard to tell whether he had all of his memories or not, since he could barely speak. The tears that came after realizing that had been heart-wrenching, but Meliodas and Zeldris had somehow figured out how to translate the youngest's chatter into words. Merlin. Merlin was not allowed near anything magical, ever, and they'd been searching for a way to lock down her power like she had with the others to no avail. Gowther had changed the least and still tended to remain sequestered up in the attic with his books. What to do, what to do? Painting might be something they'd like, though. She couldn't see how that would go wrong. It was mellow, but fun, and there were few limitations that came with paint. Yes, that might be fun. You leaked her. Shut up, Esterosa. Oh no. Elizabeth sped up. The last thing they needed now was a brawl between two tiny, volatile demons, only to come up short on the last step, raising her eyebrows in confusion. Esterosa was grinning, but the nature of the expression seemed less cruel and more triumphant, as if he'd figured a puzzle out at last. Zeldris's face, what she could see of it, he had half slipped beneath the table in what she presumed was embarrassment, was bright pink and slowly turning redder. What happened? Esterosa perked up when he noticed her standing there, grinning even wider, a spark she hadn't seen in ages glinting in midnight dark eyes. Elizabeth, you'll never be able to guess. No. The scandalized yell that came from the smaller of the two demons drowned out whatever had been about to come out of Esterosa's mouth. Zeldris toppled off the stool with a yelp, before darting to his feet. It's nothing, really. Ban snorted, a gesture that was far too derisive for that innocent face. Completely innocent, Elizabeth thought wryly. Yeah, right. Having been adopted into the group and subjected to pranks, well, pranks that were primarily intended for Meliodas but often involved her getting caught in the crossfire, she no longer believed that for a second, especially one that was smaller than the stool he clung to, and Zeldris buried his face in his hands again, red as a tomato by now. It was kind of adorable, and as pissed as Elizabeth was at Merlin, and she was just extremely good at hiding it. Disguising anger was practically an art for royalty. She couldn't help thanking her mentally for it. It would have been fine if it had just stopped with Esterosa and Zeldris. They actually needed it, but the others? What if she targets us next? Who's going to take care of them of us? She shook off the thought. The kids didn't need to see her worried. It would probably only upset them further, and they'd been through enough. Well, it clearly isn't nothing, she remarked, scooping Ban up as she made her way over to the table. No one falls off their chair and yells, no, for nothing. See? Esterosa leaned over the table and poked Zeldris's shoulder with a wicked grin. Tell her or I will. Tilda. Zeldris clamped his mouth shut and shook his head wildly, looking almost panicked. Elizabeth, caught between amusement and concern, tilted her head. Do I want to know? Yes, Esterosa shouted, looking entirely too gleeful, just as Zeldris wailed, no. Ban just beamed up at her and clapped his hands together excitedly about the closest to an understandable yes she'd be able to get from him. 2 votes to 1, she mused. She shook her head ruefully and sat down at the table. You've been outvoted, Zel. I won't tell Meliodas, though, if you don't want me to, she added. He let out an unintelligible whine, sliding back under the table and vanishing from view. That could have been worse. Looks like he saw it coming, at least. What is it, Esterosa? He grinned even wider, bouncing slightly in his seat. It's Lou de Cruz, he sang, sounding out the word carefully. That was another odd thing about the change. It had seemed purely physical at first, and they seemed to retain all their knowledge, but other things, like speech, for example, grew garbled. Certain words seemed to have become more difficult for them, as they would be for any child their age. This spell is frighteningly meticulous, she thought with a shudder. Esterosa looked up at Elizabeth with shining eyes before cooing, Zeldris is in Love. A grumble came from underneath the table. Elizabeth, managing to curb her curiosity, reached under it and squeezed Zeldris's shoulder sympathetically. She had suffered no end of teasing when her sisters uncovered her second crush. The first had been on Meliodas when she was too young to remember it. Oddly enough, that's the one that worked out. Really? Uh-huh. Esterosa nodded eagerly. With this vampire girl, she's a princess, Zeldris interrupted indignantly from beneath the table. And oh, Elizabeth stifled a laugh, ruffling his hair. So it's true? That's adorable? Too cute for words? Something that made her want to pick him up and hug him for the next 3 years? Wonderful, she decided. Will you come out from under the table and tell us about her? She felt him shake his head, moving closer until he pressed against her leg. Oh, hell, he's been turned into an absolute sweetheart. Will you stay under the table and tell us about her? Ban squirmed in her arms, reached one chubby hand down towards Zeldris and giving her a pleading look. He has no right to look so small and adorable, especially considering the fact that he's normally the opposite of small and adorable. She released a long-suffering sigh and gently set him down next to Zeldris, taking comfort in the fact that she could still feel the warm pressure of them against her legs. You don't have to, of course, but I'd like to hear about her. There was a pause. Even Esterosa didn't speak, looking vaguely interested. She felt Zeldris shift slightly against her leg, felt the air rush out of him with a whoosh as he sighed. She was kind. Elizabeth felt a smile curve her lips upward at that. She made me want to be kind, too, even though I wasn't supposed to be. Her smile was worth that, even if it made Father mad. He shuddered against her as the word father slipped past his lips, and she felt anger stir deep within her. Good thing he's dead. She was kind and she was merciful, but she wasn't weak like others said she was. Everyone said that kindness and mercy and love were weak, but they made her stronger. Elizabeth's heart broke as he pressed his head against her leg, the fabric of her leggings growing damp, and she ran her fingers through his hair again. Ban made a cooing noise and shifted closer to the smallest of the 3 demons. And I wasn't good or strong or kind or merciful like her. I'll let her get hurt, and I betrayed her. He was crying in earnest now, and Elizabeth gently pulled him out from under the table, wrapping her arms around him in a hug as Ban stood unsteadily next to her. Esterosa, who seemed to be trying to pick up some of the slack recently, drew him away with the suggestion of playing with Gowther in the attic. She could sort of remember the woman Zeldris was talking about, just a bit of flash of pale blonde hair and slate-gray eyes. Fire swirling around a woman who seemed to be a pallid, icy beauty. We crossed swords once, 3,000 years ago before Meliodas turned and before I fell. Her name, what was it? She hated it when her memories acted like this when she could recall the exact hair color of one life's little brother, but not their name or face. Absolutely useless. She supposed there was a reason for it, maybe so that she could retain her current identity, but it infuriated her at times like this. It might have been your hand that dealt the blow of sealing, but it was your father who gave the order, she murmured. Disobeying would have caused even more damage to the both of you. Perhaps we can go and break the seal? He shook his head, felt it broken, ages ago. Someone got rid of the vampires. And oh, fuck, hadn't Gowther mentioned that once? A battle with the vampires of Edinburgh? Meliodas had told her about it too, had remarked on how Escanor had obliterated their king and, if she's dead, his heart will break. There has to be a way to make this better for him. As soon as Meliodas returned from his flight, lucky bastard, getting to fly around when she'd never be able to regain the wings of her first life, she thought only half sarcastically, she asked him, making sure that Zeldris wasn't eavesdropping somewhere. The second youngest was surprisingly sneaky, or unsurprisingly, perhaps, given his upbringing. She braced herself for the answer, hope fluttering hesitantly in her chest, fluttering hesitantly, not proudly, not like a banner she could wave. Perhaps it was because she believed the vampire was long dead as well. But maybe I can at least give him some kind of closure. Gelda's alive. Elizabeth stiffened and stared at him, dumbstruck. You're kidding me. Meliodas had the good sense to look guilty, at least. He chewed on his lip as she gazed down at him, her eyes blazing with indignation. She asked me to kill her when we laid siege to Edinburgh. I couldn't do it. I knew what she meant to Zeldris, knew that she loved him and he loved her, and I used that. He looked more than guilty now, more ashamed, self-loathing clear on his face. It was the only way he'd ever give up the throne, the only person he'd give it up for. So back in Camelot, oh my gods. That was what you told him. He nodded. I put up wards that would hide her from our father's view in the coming war. Ones that would keep most monsters out. She understood what had to be done, but she wasn't happy with it. Neither was I, he admitted quietly, running a hand through his hair. I meant to give him the location, but he vanished before I could, and once he and Esterosa were banished. He told me straight to my face that he thought I was lying. Wouldn't visit when I told him where it was because he thought it was a trick. Now he trusts me again, but, well, he certainly had good reason to believe that, she thought, frowning. Protective anger warred with the urge to understand, but she beat down the feeling swiftly. I have to handle this properly. No use in getting anyone mad here. Where is it? He glanced up at her, lips quirking up into a wry smile. A little place in a forest near Canes. Part of the reason I dropped by there when we first met, the words in this lifetime went unspoken, was to check up on her. She nodded thoughtfully, weaving light around her fingers. Elizabeth was half tempted to cast her magic around her hand and send him flying, but she couldn't promise that she wouldn't have done the same thing were their situations reversed. That she wouldn't have done whatever it took, killed, lied, manipulated her way to the curse's end if it meant never having to watch him die again. Even so, where do we keep the paper again? Why are we writing letters? Merlin complained. It's dreadfully boring. Elizabeth arched an eyebrow at the warlock, who looked mildly chastised, but not enough to be quiet, of course, she grumbled mentally, but shoved it aside. Well, some of us have people we want to contact outside of here, Merlin. I thought I might contact my sisters. I figured Ban might want to know how Elaine is doing, the child in question squeaked, blushing furiously. And besides, it could be fun. You don't have to write to anyone if you don't want to, though. Thankfully, Merlin didn't, instead drifting off to, hopefully not cause an overload of mischief. Elizabeth wasn't entirely sure that she wouldn't go off on someone if Merlin decided to make things more complicated than they already were. Esterosa fiddled with the hem of his shirt before asking if he could go also, seeing as he had no one in particular to write to, which left her, Gauther, who was already scribbling away at a piece of paper, Ban, who seemed to have no inclination toward writing to Elaine about their predicament, and Zeldris, who bit his lip and blinked up at her worriedly. I don't have anyone to write to either. She stifled a sigh and wrapped an arm around him, sliding him a piece of paper. Of course you do. You have Gelda. His cheeks reddened at her name, eyes widening. But, Meliodas. Meliodas is going to sleep in the bar for the next century if he does anything like this again. Meliodas is an idiot sometimes, she told him gently, and he doesn't always think about the way his objectives might affect the people he cares about. But he wasn't lying. She's alive and safe, and she wants to hear from you. Black eyes widened, shining with hope and disbelief, and Elizabeth felt acutely how much trust that the youngest of the demons held in her. I can't break it. I won't break it, and I won't let anything break him. Really? Zeldris stammered, his face lighting up, practically glowing with raw, unbridled joy. Really, she confirmed, drawing a slip of paper over to him, tapping it gently. Here, if you need any help. He looked mortified at the very idea and she felt a thrill of amusement run through her. Some things haven't changed, it seems. Well, I'll be right here. Zeldris blinked up at her before smiling shyly. I know. Responses to the letters, even the one that she'd discreetly sent to Elaine informing her of the predicament, arrived almost immediately, as if nearly everyone they'd written to had been waiting to hear from them. Elizabeth felt a flash of guilt as she read through Veronica's scolding letter. There was a lot of, I was so goddamn worried you absolute fucking moron, in there. It was harder than she'd originally anticipated to keep up with her siblings while also traveling across Britannia. Or is it harder for them to keep up with me? Either way, it's been ages since we last spoke. She shook off the guilt and opened Margaret's letter, which communicated her eldest sister's concerns a lot more tactfully than Veronica had. A smile tugged at her lips as she read of Gil's proposal about time. You doofuses, she thought affectionately, and the wedding to come next summer. The response she'd gotten from Elaine was attached to a package, the contents of which she had yet to examine but presumed was a gift. It certainly felt soft through the giant petal wrappings, and she smiled slightly as she prodded at it again. Mail's here, she called up the stairs. That ought to do it. There was a thunder of footsteps. The boys, probably, since Diane's footsteps were light as a dancer's and King would just float downstairs. Merlin probably was tied up in another experiment and wouldn't be down for ages, even though Arthur had sent news from Camelot, Esterosa landing on the floor first and peering at the small pile of letters despite having not written anything. She ruffled his hair, earning a reluctant smile in return, before watching as he darted off outside. Good thing Hawk Mom is set down again, she thought fondly. Gowther was the next one down, 7 years old and remarkably small for his age. How did the spell even work on him? She wondered, a bit puzzled. He's a doll. He was practically created in his normal form. Unless Merlin found a way around that. That's worrying. She shook off the thought, sliding him the letter from her father. She'd glanced at the note upon realizing it was addressed to Baltra and had discovered that he wanted a memorial for her late aunt, Nadia. From what father's written, it seems like she was an amazing person. She ought to have that memorial. Be careful, she called after him as he hurried outside as well, letter clutched to his chest and his golden eyes as bright as the near-perpetual smile his child form had. Her gaze drifted back to the stairs as Meliodas descended, looking highly disheveled, with Ban in his arms and Zeldris trotting along by his side. The scene was so utterly domestic, so ordinary and warm and beautiful, that she felt tears prick at her eyes. Elizabeth forced the urge to cry back, instead smiling widely at them. Morning, sleepyheads. Meliodas blinked dazedly. He'd forgotten to tie his tie, she noticed with a spark of affection. A year of peace and look what we've become. It's wonderful, before giving her a sleepy smile, kissing her on the cheek. Morning, love. She raised her eyebrows at that. Love? I was trying it out. No? Let's stick with names for now. She pressed her forehead to his for a moment, feeling power thrum between the two of them, before drawing back and smiling at Ban. Good morning to you too. He squeaked in response, red eyes blinking furiously as he tried to clear away the last vestiges of sleep, and she heard Meliodas chuckle in response to the noise. Someone got you a present, she added, ruffling Zeldris's hair and giving him a small grin before taking the package and setting it down in front of him. His eyes widened at that, and Ban shot Meliodas a quick look, as if asking for permission. Elizabeth raised her eyes to his, noting a glimmer of worry within them. I'll have to ask him about that later. You can open it, he murmured gently, and she noted with a sudden tsunami of emotion the tenderness in the fingers that could kill so easily as they brushed the wild spikes of pale blue hair. He could kill them all in an instant, and he knows that. No wonder he's so awkward around them sometimes. She felt a warm pressure against her side and wrapped her arm around it on instinct, glancing down to see Zeldris peering nervously at the pile as Ban hesitantly picked at the wrappings of the parcel. A small gasp came from the youngest of the two, drawing her attention as the petals unfolded, revealing a small stuffed fox with silky red fur and little black buttons sewn on for the eyes and nose. Another glance was cast at Meliodas, who nodded, and Ban wrapped his arms around the fox with a delighted squeal. Only one letter was left. Is that? Zeldris's voice faded out as Meliodas slid the letter closer, revealing the elegant handwriting along the address. With shaking fingers, Zeldris opened the envelope, shadows flickering around him as he did so, and slid the letter free, black eyes scanning it slowly. Tears formed in his eyes as he read through it, but pink dusted his cheeks and a wide, deliriously happy smile had broken out on his face when he finished. I'm going to go play outside, he chirped, suddenly full of energy, as if the words on that slim sheet of paper had reignited something in him. Can Ban come with me? Meliodas opened his mouth as if to protest. Ban was still too caught up in the idea of having a whole toy just for himself, it seemed. But Kingu, mercifully, had only overheard the last few snippets of conversation, enough so that she wouldn't have to explain everything to him. Floated past at that moment with a yawn. Oslo hovering behind him making cheery, baffo, noises. I can watch him. You probably have no clue what you're getting into, Elizabeth thought dryly as Ban, clutching the fox tightly in his arms, was transferred onto Chastiful. Zeldris started to run out ahead of them with a gleeful shout, the letter clutched tightly in his hand before Elizabeth called him back. Zeldris, it might get damaged outside. Leave your letter here with me and I'll look after it. Zeldris shot Elizabeth a thoughtful look, before quickly running back and solemnly handing the letter to her before rushing outside. Once the boys were gone, Elizabeth looked at Meliodas, fought her curiosity for about a minute, then slowly shifted over to sit beside him, pulled the letter between the two of them, eyes drifting down the page.
That's all for now. If you enjoy this video, then please like, share and do comments.